My name is Calvin. I am 64 years old. I am a retired longshoreman. For 30 years, I worked the graveyard shifts down at the Savannah port so my wife and stepson could live like absolute royalty. If you are listening to this right now, I need you to pay close attention. When my wife Valerie slid those glossy nursing home brochures across my kitchen table, wiping away her fake tears and whispering that it was for my own good, I just nodded. I sat there trembling like the broken old man she thought I was. But what she did not know was that tucked right there inside the pocket of my fleece robe was the hidden camera footage proving she was selling my entire life's work to fund a new life with another man. Valerie and her son had absolutely no idea that I was wide awake and I was about to burn their entire empire to the ground. If you have ever given everything to a family only to be treated like a burden, leave a like on this video to support an old man's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. It all started on a Tuesday morning. I had been retired for a few years, finally trying to rest after a lifetime of hard labor. My body was already carrying the heavy aches and pains of 3 decades on the docks. Loading and unloading massive cargo containers in the freezing rain and the blistering Georgia heat takes a severe toll on a man's bones. You learn to live with a constant ache in your lower back and calluses on your hands that feel like rough leather. But I was strong. I always prided myself on being the strong oak tree of our family. I was out in the front yard tending to the rose bushes that Valerie loved so much when the world just suddenly tilted. It was not a slow fade. It was an instant violent shift. My left arm went completely numb. The metal pruning shears slipped right out of my hand and hit the grass with a dull thud. Then my left leg gave out. I tried to call out for help, to shout for my wife, but my tongue felt heavy, thick, and useless. I hit the ground hard. I remember the smell of the damp earth and the terrifying panic gripping my chest as I realized I could not move half of my body. I thought that was it. I thought my time on this earth was done. I woke up hours later in a stark white hospital bed. The steady rhythmic beep of a heart monitor filled the quiet room. The doctor, a kind and patient young man, stood at the foot of my bed with a reassuring smile. He told me I had suffered a mild ischemic stroke. It was a serious warning sign, he explained, but it was highly survivable. With proper rest, physical therapy, and a strict regimen of medication, I would be back on my feet in no time. I breathed a massive sigh of relief. I silently thanked the Lord for giving me another chance at life. I turned my head and saw Valerie sitting in the corner chair. She was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the terrified, doting wife to absolute perfection. She rushed to my side, held my good hand, and told me not to worry about a single thing. She said she was going to take care of me. She said we were in this together, in sickness and in health. I believed her. I loved that woman with every fiber of my being, and I trusted her blindly. But the nightmare did not begin in that hospital room. It began the moment she brought me back to the beautiful, sprawling house I had built for us in the affluent Atlanta suburbs. I was physically weak. I needed a sturdy wooden cane to make the short walk from the bed to the bathroom, and my speech was still a little slow and slurred. I needed a partner to help me through the recovery. Instead, I got a warden. Within the first 3 days of being home, the systematic isolation started. It was subtle at first, masked as care and concern. I reached for my cell phone on the nightstand to call Pastor Williams. I just wanted to hear a familiar voice and let my church family know I was home and resting. But my phone was gone. The charger was there, but the phone had vanished. When I asked Valerie about it, she gave me this sweet, condescending smile that made my stomach churn. She said she had put it away for safekeeping. She told me the cardiologist said stress was incredibly bad for my heart, and that talking to people on the phone would just exhaust my brain. I tried to argue. I tried to raise my voice, but I was so weak, and she just patted my head like I was an ignorant child. A few days later, I heard the doorbell ring. Through the thick walls of the house, I heard the deep, booming, familiar voice of Pastor Williams and a few of the senior brothers from my church. They had come to pray with me and check on my spirit. I tried to sit up in bed, my heart lifting at the sound of my true friends. But then I heard Valerie at the front door. Her voice was hushed, dripping with fake sorrow. She told them I was sleeping deeply. She told them I was far too frail to have visitors, and that it was breaking her heart to see me so diminished and confused. I heard their heavy footsteps walking away from my porch, their voices fading into the distance. I was trapped in my own master bedroom, listening to the silence settle over the massive house like a thick, suffocating blanket. Lying in that bed day after endless day, staring at the ceiling fan spinning round and round. My mind went to some very dark places. I thought about the 30 years of blood, sweat, and tears I had given to that woman. When I first met Valerie, she was a struggling single mother working a dead-end job. She was drowning in massive credit card debt, constantly dodging calls from collection agencies, and barely keeping the lights on in her tiny apartment. Her son DeAndre was just a little boy, desperately looking for a father figure. I stepped up. I believed that is what a real man does. He provides, he protects, he shields his family from the harshness of the world. I worked double shifts until my muscles screamed for mercy. I worked every major holiday. While other men were home sitting around the fireplace carving the Thanksgiving turkey or opening Christmas presents with their families, I was out on the freezing wind-whipped docks securing massive steel shipping containers so my family could have a warm, comfortable home. I paid off every single cent of Valerie's debt without complaining once. I treated DeAndre like he was my own flesh and blood. When he grew up and decided he wanted to go to a highly expensive, out-of-state private college, I did not hesitate for a second. I dipped deep into my hard-earned savings and paid his tuition in full in cash. I never asked for a thank you. I never held it over their heads. Seeing them happy, seeing them wearing nice clothes and driving safe cars, that was my reward. That was my pride as a husband and a father. But now, in my darkest moment of need, the house felt incredibly cold. DeAndre, who was now a grown man, barely even poked his head into my room to check if I was breathing. He would stomp past my door, shouting down the hallway to his mother about needing money for his car note or complaining about how busy his social schedule was. He was a grown adult, living rent-free under my roof, eating the expensive food I paid for. But he looked at me like I was a piece of broken, useless furniture, taking up valuable space. As I lay there listening to DeAndre's entitled complaints, my heart ached with a different kind of pain. I thought about my own flesh and blood, my biological daughter Jasmine from my first marriage. Over the last 15 years, Valerie had systematically poisoned that well. It started with small things, Valerie pretending to forget to mail Jasmine's birthday gifts, or picking massive arguments right before Jasmine was supposed to visit, making the house so incredibly hostile that my daughter eventually stopped coming around. Valerie convinced me that Jasmine only cared about my money, twisting my daughter's independence into an insult against me. Like an absolute fool, I listened to my wife. I let the distance between me and my real daughter grow into a massive canyon, trading my own blood to keep the peace with a woman who was now treating me like a stray dog. The regret tasted bitter in the back of my throat. I had pushed away the only person in this world who genuinely loved me just for being her father. And Valerie, the woman I had worshipped and provided for, was slowly revealing a side of herself that chilled the very blood in my veins. The tension escalated from subtle neglect to downright cruelty when the severe physical pain set in. The neurologist had prescribed a very specific set of medications to manage the intense muscle spasms in my left leg and to keep my blood pressure perfectly stable to prevent another stroke. I was supposed to take them strictly twice a day. But by the second week of my confinement, Valerie started rationing my pills. I would wake up in the dead of the night, my left side cramping and twisting so violently that it brought hot tears to my eyes. I would call out for her in the dark. She would finally walk in, letting out a loud, annoyed sigh, and tell me I had already had my dose. When I begged her for my medication, my voice trembling from the sheer agony, she sat on the edge of the bed. She looked down at me with cold, flat, empty eyes. She told me the insurance company was cutting us off. She claimed my premium health insurance policy was maxed out and that the exorbitant out-of-pocket costs for the pills were draining our bank accounts dry. She said we simply could not afford to give me the full dosage anymore. I lay there clutching my chest as a sudden sharp alarm bell rang loudly in my head. It was not the stroke clouding my mind. It was pure, undeniable common sense. I was a 30-year union veteran. My health insurance through the Longshoremen's Union was absolutely ironclad. It was one of the best policies in the state. We had premium top-tier coverage that I had paid into for 3 straight decades. There was absolutely no way in this world under any circumstances that my policy was maxed out over a simple 2-week hospital stay and some basic generic prescriptions. It was a complete financial impossibility. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name, but looking up at Valerie's perfectly made-up face, I realized something terrifying. She did not know that I knew. She thought the stroke had made me stupid. She thought my brain was as weak and useless as my paralyzed leg. She assumed I was just a helpless, senile old man who would swallow whatever lie she fed me. She reached out and stroked my cheek. Her touch felt like ice against my warm skin. She leaned in close and whispered that things were getting very tight financially. She put on a sad face and said she was doing her absolute best to keep our heads above water, but that I needed to stop complaining and just endure the pain for the sake of the family's survival. She told me to be a man and tough it out. Then she stood up, left the room, and turned off the light, shutting the door behind her. I was left completely alone in the pitch-black darkness, my muscles knotting in agonizing pain, wrestling with a horrifying realization. The woman I had protected my entire life was not trying to heal me. She was trying to break me. She was deliberately withholding the medicine I needed to survive. She was intentionally cutting me off from the outside world and my friends. She was feeding me blatant lies about my own finances and insurance. And because I could barely walk without falling over, I was completely, utterly at her mercy. As I lay in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of the television playing in the living room, where Valerie and DeAndre sat comfortably. The physical agony in my leg was overshadowed by a burning clarity in my mind. I was a man who had spent his life loading thousands of tons of cargo. I knew how to bear heavy weight. I knew how to endure the dark. And I knew that if I confronted her now, a crippled old man with no phone and no proof, she would easily overpower me or simply lock me away in a state ward before I could speak to a judge. I had to be smart. I had to swallow my pride, bite my tongue, and let her believe that her cruel plan was working flawlessly. The stroke might have taken my strength, but it had not taken my mind. I was going to figure out exactly what kind of trap she was building for me, and then I was going to use it to bury her. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning. I was lying flat on my back in the master bedroom, staring up at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. My left leg was throbbing with a dull, heavy ache that radiated all the way up to my lower spine. But the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the storm raging inside my head. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford right now. Not when the woman sleeping in the guest room down the hall was deliberately withholding my medication. Not when she had looked me dead in the eye and lied about my union health insurance being maxed out. I was a proud black man who had spent 30 years on the Savannah docks. I knew how the world worked. I knew the value of $1, and I knew exactly what my benefits covered. Valerie thought the stroke had scrambled my brain. She thought I was just a crippled old fool who would quietly fade away in the dark. But my mind was sharp, sharper than it had been in years. I needed answers. I needed to know exactly what kind of game my wife was playing while I was trapped in this bed. I threw the heavy quilt off my body with my good right arm. The cold night air hit my skin, causing a shiver to run down my neck. Getting out of bed used to be an effortless motion. Now it was a monumental task. I swung my right leg over the edge of the mattress, and then I had to reach down and physically drag my numb left leg to follow. My feet touched the cold, hardwood floor. I reached out and grabbed the sturdy wooden cane resting against the nightstand. I gripped the curved handle so tightly, my knuckles ached. I pushed myself up. My left side wobbled, threatening to give out completely, but I locked my knee and held my ground. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart. Every single step was a calculated risk. I slowly shuffled toward the bedroom door, planting the cane, leaning my weight on it, and dragging my left foot forward. The house was entirely silent, except for the low hum of the central air conditioning. This was my house. I paid for every brick, every plank of wood, every piece of crown molding with the sweat of my brow and the calluses on my hands. Now it felt like a prison. I made my way down the long carpeted hallway, leaning heavily on my cane. The journey to the living room took me 5 excruciating minutes. My chest was heaving by the time I reached the archway. The moonlight spilled through the large bay windows, casting a silver glow over the expensive Italian leather sofas and the imported glass coffee table Valerie had insisted on buying last year. I stood in the archway, catching my breath. And then I saw it. Resting right there on the middle cushion of the love seat was Valerie's silver tablet. The screen was dark, but I knew she never let that device out of her sight during the day. She practically lived on it, shopping online, chatting with her friends, managing the household accounts that I had foolishly handed over to her. She left it out tonight simply because she thought I was completely incapacitated. She assumed I was physically incapable of walking the 50 feet from my bed to the living room without her help. Her arrogance was about to be her downfall. I slowly lowered myself onto the plush sofa, groaning, as my stiff joints protested. I set my cane aside and picked up the tablet with my good hand. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. If she woke up and caught me out here, the fragile illusion of my helplessness would be shattered instantly. I pressed the home button. The screen illuminated the dark room with a bright, glaring light. I quickly turned the brightness down, hoping the glow would not reflect down the hallway. To my absolute shock, the tablet was completely unlocked. Valerie had not bothered to put the passcode in before she went to sleep. She truly believed I was a defeated man who posed absolutely no threat. I tapped on the screen, navigating past her social media apps and her mindless games. I was looking for the banking folder. I wanted to see the financial statements. I needed to see exactly what she was doing with our money and why she was claiming we could not afford my stroke medication. I opened her email application, hoping to find a message from the insurance provider or a digital receipt from the pharmacy. The inbox refreshed, loading dozens of unread messages. I scrolled past the promotional emails, the clothing store discounts, and the neighborhood association newsletters. I was scanning for anything related to our finances. But what I found was something far more terrifying than a simple stolen bank statement. A bold, unread email caught my eye. It was from a premium real estate brokerage firm based right here in the wealthy suburbs of Atlanta. The subject line read, "Urgent updates regarding your property listing and pre-approval." I felt a cold knot form in the very pit of my stomach. Property listing. I blinked hard, hoping my aging eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim light. I tapped on the email and opened the message. The text on the screen hit me with the force of a freight train. It was an incredibly detailed message from a high-end real estate agent named Cynthia. The email outlined a highly aggressive marketing strategy for a private off-market sale. I scrolled down with a trembling thumb. Attached to the bottom of the email was a digital flyer. It was my house. The sprawling, beautiful brick home that I had bought in cash. The home I had poured my entire life savings into, so my wife and my stepson could live with dignity and pride. There were professional glossy photographs of my living room, my renovated kitchen, and even the landscaped backyard with the expensive patio deck. The staging notes indicated that the property was highly desirable and ready for an immediate cash closing. I read the asking price and I physically stopped breathing. $900,000. They were listing my home for nearly $1 million without saying a single word to me. The agent's message went on to explain that since the market was currently booming, they expected a bidding war and they requested that Valerie confirm the final routing number for the offshore escrow account to ensure a rapid transfer of funds. Offshore account. My mind was spinning trying to process the magnitude of this betrayal. This was not just a case of a wife being irresponsible with a credit card. This was a calculated, deliberate, and massive financial assassination. She was secretly selling the roof right over my head. My house was completely paid off. There was no mortgage. If she sold this property for cash and wired the money offshore, the wealth I had sacrificed my entire adulthood to build would simply vanish into thin air. I would be left completely destitute, a crippled old longshoreman with absolutely nothing to his name. The sheer weight of the betrayal pressed down on my chest, making it incredibly hard to draw air into my lungs. I sat there in the dark, clutching the glowing tablet, staring at the glossy pictures of my own living room, while sitting in that exact same living room. How long had she been planning this? How long had she looked at me across the dinner table, knowing she was going to leave me with absolutely nothing? I was so consumed by the shocking revelation that I almost did not hear the sound outside. The crunch of gravel in the circular driveway. The low, aggressive rumble of a sports car engine pulling up to the front of the house. Headlights suddenly swept across the closed blinds of the living room, casting long, terrifying shadows across the walls. It was DeAndre. My stepson was coming home from whatever late nightclub or underground betting parlor he had been haunting. Pure adrenaline shot through my veins, completely overriding the pain in my paralyzed leg. If DeAndre walked through that front door and saw me sitting in the dark, holding his mother's unlocked tablet, the entire game would be over. They would know that I knew everything. They would realize I was not a mindless invalid. They could force me into a facility the very next morning, or worse, they could ensure I never made it out of this house alive. I had to get back to my bed immediately. I hastily closed the email application, making sure the screen looked exactly as I had found it. I gently placed the device back onto the middle cushion of the love seat. I grabbed my wooden cane and forced myself to stand up. My left leg buckled in protest, shooting a blinding spike of agony up my hip, but I bit down hard on my lower lip to keep from crying out. I heard the heavy clunk of a car door slamming shut outside. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the front porch. I moved as fast as my broken body would allow. I dragged my heavy left foot across the carpet, using the cane to vault my weight forward. Every single step felt like walking through thick mud. I reached the dark hallway just as I heard the metallic jingle of keys being shoved into the front door lock. I moved down the corridor, my breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. The front door creaked open, echoing loudly in the quiet house. I slipped through the doorway of the master bedroom and quietly pulled the door almost completely shut, leaving just a tiny sliver of a crack. I practically threw myself onto the mattress, letting the cane fall silently onto the thick rug. I yanked the heavy quilt up to my chin, turned my head toward the wall, and squeezed my eyes shut. I focused entirely on regulating my breathing, forcing my chest to rise and fall in the slow, rhythmic pattern of a man in a deep, medicated sleep. My heart was thudding so violently against my ribcage I was genuinely terrified they would be able to hear it. Heavy, unhurried footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor of the foyer. DeAndre was inside. I heard the muffled sound of a door opening down the hall. Valerie was stepping out of the guest bedroom. She must have been waiting up for him. Their footsteps converged in the hallway, stopping right outside the cracked door of my bedroom. The silence in the house made their whispered voices sound incredibly loud to my straining ears. "Did you get it done?" Valerie whispered, her tone sharp and anxious. "Did you meet with the broker?" "Yeah, I got it handled," DeAndre replied, his voice dripping with his usual lazy arrogance. "The guy was asking a lot of annoying questions, but I slipped him the extra cash just like you said. We are locked in for the expedited closing next Friday." I heard Valerie let out a long breath of relief. "Good," she muttered. "We cannot afford any delays. If those loan sharks come looking for you again, I cannot protect you. The offshore account is ready to receive the wire transfer the minute the buyer signs the deed." DeAndre chuckled a low, greedy sound that made my stomach turn. "What about the old man?" he asked. "Is he going to be a problem? What if he wakes up and realizes what is happening before the sale goes through?" "Do not worry about Calvin, Valerie," said her voice, turning incredibly cold and dismissive. "He can barely string a sentence together, let alone read a legal document." The stroke completely cooked his brain. "Besides, I already took care of the legalities. The old man's signature cleared the power of attorney yesterday morning. The notary stamped it without batting an eye. I legally control every single asset attached to his name now." DeAndre laughed again. A rich, sinister laugh. "You are a genius, Mom. We are going to be living like kings in Jamaica by the end of the month, while he rots in that state ward." I lay there under the heavy quilt, completely frozen in place. The darkness of the room seemed to press down on me from all sides. The words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. The old man's signature cleared the power of attorney. I had not signed any legal documents since I was admitted to the hospital. I had not authorized anyone to take control of my finances or my estate. Valerie had brazenly forged my signature to steal my legal rights. I was no longer just a neglected husband suffering in a back bedroom. I was a man being systematically and legally erased from existence. They were going to steal my $1 million home, take my hard-earned cash, run off to an island, and throw me into a miserable state-funded facility to die alone. They thought I was a helpless ghost, completely powerless to stop them. But as I lay there listening to them walk away down the hall, a cold, fiery determination ignited deep within my soul. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated a man who had survived 30 years on the brutal Savannah docks. I was not a ghost yet. I was wide awake, and I was going to make sure they paid for every single drop of blood they were trying to steal from me. The morning sun slipped through the heavy plantation shutters of my bedroom, casting thin golden slices of light across the hardwood floor. I lay perfectly still, listening to the quiet symphony of my own house waking up around me. Down the hall, I could hear the faint clank of a coffee mug in the kitchen and the low, steady murmur of a morning news broadcast. To the rest of the world, it was just another tranquil suburban morning. But to me, this bed was a trench, and I was surrounded by enemy fire. The knowledge of that forged document sat like a concrete block squarely on my chest. I knew exactly what my wife was capable of now. I knew that if I grabbed my cane, limped out there, and confronted Valerie with righteous fury, she would not flinch. She would simply look at me with practiced sorrowful pity and dial 911. She would tell the paramedics that her poor invalid husband was suffering from severe stroke-induced dementia, that I was hallucinating, that I was a danger to myself. Armed with that fraudulent power of attorney, she held the absolute legal authority to strip away my freedom in a matter of hours. I was a hostage inside the very walls I had broken my back to build. I needed undeniable, airtight proof. I needed a weapon sharp enough to cut through her web of lies and shatter the flawless facade she presented to the world. I spent the entire morning staring up at the slow, lazy rotation of the ceiling fan, formulating a strategy. When you spend 30 years organizing massive freight logistics on a shipping dock, you learn a fundamental truth. You do not move mountains with brute force. You move them with leverage, timing, and relentless patience. Around noon, my bedroom door creaked open. Valerie walked in carrying a small plastic tray, holding a bowl of lukewarm oatmeal and my severely rationed pain medication. She was dressed in a crisp, elegant white linen suit that smelled faintly of the expensive Parisian perfume I had bought for her last Christmas. She sat gracefully on the edge of my mattress, smoothing out the wrinkles in my blanket, with a terrifying theatrical tenderness. She softly told me she had to run some errands in the city, and that DeAndre was dead asleep in his room down the hall. She leaned down, kissed my forehead, and whispered for me to rest my weary bones. I forced the muscles in my face to remain completely slack. I blinked slowly, letting my jaw hang just a fraction, nodding like an obedient, exhausted old fool. But the very second I heard the heavy crunch of her SUV tires rolling out of the gravel driveway, I threw the heavy quilt off my body. I grabbed my sturdy wooden cane and hoisted myself upright. My entire left side screamed in violent protest, the muscles seizing and burning with a fiery heat. But I swallowed the agony. I had a mission. I shuffled out of the bedroom, navigating the long corridor toward the attached garage. My old heavy-gauge steel toolbox sat on the bottom shelf of the dusty workbench, resting in the exact spot I had left it before the stroke took me down. I pried the stiff metal latch open with my good right hand. Buried deep underneath a tangled pile of rusty crescent wrenches and spare socket sets was a secret false bottom. Hidden inside was a prepaid emergency debit card. I had kept it stashed there for over a decade, an old survival habit from my early days on the docks when cash was tight and unforeseen disasters were plenty. The card was entirely untraceable. It was not linked to my social security number, and more importantly, it was nowhere near the joint banking accounts Valerie currently monitored like a hawk. Next, I needed a way to order the surveillance equipment without her intercepting the package. I could not risk using the home computer, and having a suspicious box show up on my own front porch was out of the question. I pulled my battered insulated work jacket from the brass hook by the garage door and draped it over my trembling shoulders. I slowly made my way out the side door, stepping into the crisp air of the backyard. My neighbor lived right across the rusted chain-link fence. His name was Leon. We had worked side by side hauling steel and timber at Local 1414 for over 2 decades. Leon was a man forged from the exact same rough, unyielding iron as I was. We had survived brutal coastal hurricanes, bitter labor strikes, and the shifting, unpredictable tides of the shipping industry. I knew his daily routine like clockwork. Every single afternoon at exactly 1 o'clock, he sat on his back patio drinking a mug of pitch-black coffee while reading the sports section of the local paper. I gripped the cold metal of the chain-link fence to steady my wobbling frame and called out his name in a harsh, desperate whisper. Leon looked up instantly, dropping his newspaper, startled to see me out of bed and standing in the yard. He jogged over to the fence line, his weathered face deeply creased with genuine concern. He asked me what in God's name I was doing outside, looking as pale as a ghost. I did not have the luxury of time to explain the entire labyrinth of my nightmare. I looked my old brother dead in the eye and told him that my life was in severe, immediate danger. I told him my wife had cut off my communication with the outside world and was deliberately starving me of my prescribed medication. The shock in Leon's eyes quickly hardened into a fierce, protective fury. I slipped the plastic prepaid card through the diamond-shaped gaps in the fencing. I gave him strict, precise instructions. I needed a motion-activated, high-definition hidden camera. I told him to order it online with overnight shipping and to bring it over concealed inside something completely unsuspicious. Leon did not ask for a single justification. He just reached through the wire, gripped my calloused hand tightly, gave me a solemn nod, and swore he had my back. That is the beauty of true blue-collar brotherhood. It never demands an explanation when it smells smoke in your house. The next 48 hours were a grueling psychological torture test. I had to force pleasant smiles at Valerie while my stomach churned with pure acid. I had to swallow the bland, watery soup and the blatant, patronizing lies she constantly fed me. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, the front doorbell chimed. It was Leon standing on the porch, holding a large foil-covered glass baking dish. He played his part flawlessly, loudly, telling Valerie he had brought over a fresh, homemade peach cobbler from his wife to cheer up his ailing old friend. Valerie tried her best to turn him away at the threshold, claiming I was too weak for company, but Leon simply pushed his massive frame inside with his booming, jovial voice, pretending he was just too stubborn to take no for an answer. He marched right past her, walked straight into my bedroom, set the heavy glass dish firmly on my nightstand, and gave me one long, meaningful look before Valerie practically shoved him back out the front door. Buried deep underneath the warm, sweet-smelling cobbler, wrapped tightly in layers of heavy plastic, was a small, matte black box. It was a state-of-the-art micro camera no larger than a standard matchbox, equipped with a tiny, wide-angle lens and a high-capacity memory card. Now came the most treacherous part of the operation. I had to position it perfectly in the main living room, the exact place where the two of them spent all their time plotting my demise. That night, I waited in the dark until the house fell completely silent. Valerie had retired to the distant guest bedroom, and DeAndre's sports car was gone from the driveway. I crept down the hallway, the only illumination coming from the amber streetlights filtering through the living room blinds. Sitting proudly on the large mahogany bookshelf against the far wall was an antique wooden-cased radio I had purchased at a vintage estate sale many years ago. It had not played a single tune in over a decade, but its position faced the entire living room, perfectly capturing a full view of the leather sofas, the glass coffee table, and the main entryway. I leaned my cane securely against the wall and carefully lifted the heavy wooden radio. My left arm shook violently under the awkward weight, but pure, unadulterated adrenaline fueled my muscles. I used a small pocket knife to pry the stiff wooden back panel loose. I scooped out the old, dusty vacuum tubes and carefully nested the tiny camera inside the hollowed-out cavity, aligning the microscopic lens flawlessly with the decorative fabric mesh covering the front speaker. I secured the device with a thick strip of heavy-duty tape, pressed the silent activation button, and snapped the back panel into place. I set the radio exactly where it had originally rested, angling it precisely toward the center of the room. I wiped a layer of cold sweat from my brow, grabbed my cane, and vanished back into the shadows of my bedroom, just seconds before I saw sweeping headlights illuminate the front driveway. For 3 agonizing days, I left the camera untouched. I endured the condescending pats on my head from Valerie and the disrespectful, sneering scowls from her son. Every night, I lay awake staring at the dark ceiling, my mind racing, wondering exactly what that silent digital witness was capturing on the bookshelf. Finally, on Sunday morning, Valerie proudly announced she was taking DeAndre to an upscale brunch downtown. She locked the heavy front door behind her, leaving me completely alone in the oppressive, echoing silence. I scrambled out of bed, abandoning my cane altogether, leaning my full body weight heavily against the hallway drywall as I dragged my dead leg into the living room. I pulled the small black camera from the hollowed-out antique radio and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door firmly behind me. I slid the tiny memory card into a dusty, outdated laptop I had kept hidden at the very bottom of my closet. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely guide the digital cursor across the glowing screen. I opened the media folder and hit play. What I witnessed over the next 2 hours completely and utterly shattered my soul. It is one thing to deeply suspect betrayal. It is a completely different soul-crushing agony to watch it unfold in high definition right in the middle of your own personal sanctuary. The first video file was recorded late Friday night. Valerie and DeAndre were sitting comfortably on the expensive leather sofa. Resting right there on the delicate glass coffee table was a bottle of my highly prized 20-year-old bourbon, the exact bottle I had been saving unopened for my official retirement celebration. DeAndre poured himself a massive, sloppy glass, laughing loudly as he kicked his dirty designer sneakers up onto the pristine glass. I watched my wife holding a crystal tumbler, smiling warmly at a grown man who contributed absolutely nothing to our household. DeAndre took a long, greedy sip of my liquor and leaned back. The hidden microphone picked up the audio with crystal clarity. He was complaining bitterly about aggressive debt collectors blowing up his burner phone. He casually mentioned that the men running the underground sports betting rings were rapidly losing their patience. I felt a freezing chill wash entirely over me as he rattled off the specific numbers. He was not in debt for a few $1,000s. He had racked up a staggering $150,000 in gambling losses, recklessly betting on college basketball spreads and overseas horse racing. He had borrowed heavy cash from incredibly dangerous, unforgiving people in the city. Valerie reached over and gently patted his knee. I heard her voice smooth, soothing, and chillingly calm. She told him not to worry his pretty head. She told him she had already moved another $20,000 out of my retirement account to keep the loan shark satisfied for the month. She sat there in my house drinking my liquor, casually admitting to systematically draining the 401k I had built over 30 years of breaking my spine in the freezing rain. She was using my literal blood money to cover the reckless gambling debts of her lazy, arrogant son. But the sheer horror of the footage did not stop there. The next video file was from Saturday afternoon. DeAndre was nowhere in the room. Valerie was sitting alone on the sofa, speaking animatedly on her cell phone via speakerphone. The deep, resonant voice echoing through my living room belonged to a man with a thick, smooth Jamaican accent. He lovingly called her his queen. He asked her when she was finally coming home to him. I sat staring at the glowing laptop screen, my chest tightening with a physical pain that easily rivaled the stroke itself. Valerie laughed, a bright, girlish, flirty laugh that I had not heard from her in over a decade. She told this unknown man that the agonizing wait was almost completely over. She promised him that the massive funds were practically secured. I listened in absolute stomach-turning disgust as she detailed how she had been secretly wiring my money offshore for the past 2 years, funding the ground-up construction of a luxurious beachfront villa in Montego Bay. She had a secret fiancé. While I was putting in grueling overtime shifts at the port, actively destroying my joints to pay for her extravagant lifestyle, she was building a tropical, sun-drenched paradise with another man. My entire marriage, the last 30 years of my trusting existence, had been nothing but a meticulously crafted, parasitic illusion. I was nothing but a blind workhorse pulling a heavy cart for thieves. I clicked on the final video file. It was recorded late Saturday night. Valerie and DeAndre were hovering over a stack of paperwork spread out across the coffee table. I recognized the thick documents immediately. They were the premium real estate listing agreements and the forged notarized power of attorney. DeAndre was pacing back and forth across the rug, looking highly nervous. He asked her what would happen if the bank's fraud department flagged the massive wire transfer from the house sale. He asked what would happen if I somehow found a miraculous way to contact the authorities before the offshore money cleared. Valerie did not even bother looking up from the paperwork. Her voice was completely devoid of any human warmth or hesitation. It was the voice of a cold, calculating apex predator. I will never forget the exact words she spoke while staring at the very papers designed to erase my existence. She smiled a wicked, hollow smile and looked up at her son. Once he is locked in the state ward on Tuesday, we close the house sale on Friday. By the time he realizes he is completely broke, he won't even be able to afford a lawyer to complain. He will be eating mashed peas in a lockdown unit with no phone and no rights. The money will be safely resting in Jamaica before the weekend is over. The video ended, and the computer screen faded to pitch black. I sat in the dim light of my bedroom, the heavy silence of the house pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. The betrayal was so incredibly deep, so entirely consuming, that it burned away every last ounce of fear and sorrow living inside me. Tuesday. That was the day she planned to throw me into a miserable state-funded facility. Friday was the day the house would be sold, and my generational wealth would disappear across the ocean forever. I looked at the digital clock glowing in the bottom corner of the laptop screen. It was Sunday afternoon. I had exactly 5 days. 5 days to outsmart a woman who held every single legal advantage. 5 days to dismantle a vicious plan that had been years in the making. 5 days to save my own life. I slowly closed the laptop and placed my trembling hands flat on the desk. The old Calvin, the man who loved her deeply, the man who sacrificed everything to make her happy, died right there in that chair. The man who stood up leaning heavily on his wooden cane was a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I was going to let her pack my bags. I was going to let her walk into that upscale real estate office on Friday morning, and then I was going to bring down a storm so fierce it would wipe her entirely off the map. The digital clock on my nightstand flashed 3 a.m. in a harsh crimson glow. I lay perfectly still in the master bedroom, listening to the heavy silence of the house. I had exactly 5 days before Valerie threw me into a state-funded lockdown facility and sold the very roof over my head. I was entirely trapped in my own home, physically broken, legally erased, and completely isolated. When my trusted neighbor Leon had smuggled in that hidden camera inside the peach cobbler dish, he had also slipped a small, cheap, prepaid cell phone into the bottom of the plastic grocery bag. It was a bulky, outdated device with rubber buttons, but to me, it was a lifeline to the outside world. I reached under my mattress with my right hand, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic of the phone. Pulling it out felt like lifting a massive cinder block. Every muscle in my body was screaming from the sheer exhaustion of my stroke recovery and the agonizing lack of proper medication. I stared at the glowing screen of that cheap phone. I needed outside help, but I could not risk calling the local police. Valerie held a notarized, legally binding power of attorney. If patrol officers showed up at my front door, she would simply produce the documents, put on her sweet, sorrowful face, and tell them her husband was suffering from severe stroke-induced dementia. They would look at my crippled leg, listen to my slurred speech, and they would believe her. They would leave and she would expedite my transfer to the ward by sunrise. I needed someone with a sharp mind, someone who understood the intricate, tangled web of high-level finances. I needed my biological daughter, Jasmine, but dialing her number was the absolute hardest thing I had ever done in my 64 years on this earth. My pride was a heavy, suffocating coat I had worn for decades. Over the past 15 years, Valerie had systematically poisoned my relationship with my firstborn child. It started subtly, with Valerie claiming Jasmine was disrespectful or twisting my daughter's words to make it seem like she only cared about my longshoreman pension. When Jasmine went to college and started building her own successful life, Valerie convinced me that my daughter viewed me as an uneducated, blue-collar embarrassment. Like a blind, foolish old man, I swallowed every single drop of that poison. I stopped calling. I missed her graduation. I missed the milestones of her 20s. I traded my own flesh and blood for the illusion of a peaceful marriage with a woman who was now actively plotting my demise. My thumb hovered over the rubber keypad. My heart pounded so violently against my ribs, I thought the noise would surely wake Valerie in the guest room down the hall. I punched in the familiar digits from memory. The phone began to ring. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. The sound echoed in the tiny speaker, each chime a brutal reminder of the massive canyon I had allowed to grow between us. On the 5th ring, the line clicked open. A groggy, cautious voice spoke on the other end. She asked who was calling at this hour. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back a sudden, overwhelming wave of tears. "Jasmine," I whispered, my voice rough and cracking with emotion. "It is your dad." The line went completely dead silent. The silence stretched on for so long, I thought she had simply hung up the phone. I could practically feel the 15 years of rejection, the missed birthdays and the cold holidays hanging heavily in the digital air between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp, guarded, and entirely professional. She did not call me Dad. She called me Calvin. She asked me why I was calling her from an unknown number in the middle of the night. Hearing my own daughter call me by my first name felt like a physical blow to my chest, but I knew I deserved it. I deserved every ounce of her resentment. I swallowed the last remaining shreds of my foolish pride. I told her I was wrong. I told her I had been a blind, arrogant fool for choosing a lying woman over my own brilliant child. I apologized for the years of silence, my voice breaking uncontrollably in the dark room. I wept, shedding tears of profound regret that I had held back for over a decade. I told her I did not expect her forgiveness, and I did not expect her love. But I told her that I was completely trapped, that my life was in severe danger, and that I had absolutely no one else in this world to turn to. The defensive frost in Jasmine's voice melted instantly. Blood is a powerful thing. Beneath the years of justified anger, she was still my little girl, and she possessed the fierce, protective spirit of my late parents. The moment she heard the raw, unadulterated terror trembling in my voice, her professional demeanor shifted into pure, razor-sharp focus. She asked me exactly what was happening. I gave her the short, terrifying version. I told her about the stroke, the stolen medication, the forged power of attorney, and the hidden camera footage proving Valerie was selling my paid-off estate to fund a secret life in Jamaica. I heard the sound of rustling sheets and a muffled conversation on her end. She was waking up her husband. Jasmine told me to stay perfectly still and to play along with whatever Valerie demanded. She lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, nearly 5 hours away by car. She promised me she was leaving right that very second and would drive straight through the pitch-black night to reach me. She told me to leave the heavy iron side gate unlocked so she could slip through the backyard without alerting anyone in the front. I thanked her, my voice barely a whisper, and ended the call. For the first time since my stroke, a tiny, brilliant spark of hope ignited in my chest. The agonizing wait began. The hours crawled by at a torturous pace. As dawn broke, the sky outside my window turned a pale, bruised purple. I heard the house begin to stir. DeAndre left early, the aggressive roar of his sports car engine fading down the suburban street as he headed off to handle whatever shady debts he was desperately trying to outrun. A short while later, Valerie pushed my bedroom door open. She was dressed impeccably, holding a steaming cup of herbal tea and my heavily rationed morning pills. She smiled her sickeningly sweet smile, her eyes glittering with a predatory excitement she could barely contain. She fluffed my pillows and cheerfully informed me that she had a very important appointment at a high-end salon in Buckhead. She said she needed a premium keratin treatment and a manicure because she had a crucial meeting with some estate planners on Friday morning. I knew exactly what that meeting was. It was the closing table for my house. I forced my face to remain dull and vacant. I nodded slowly, deliberately, letting my hand tremble as I reached for the teacup, playing the role of the defeated invalid flawlessly. She patted my cheek with a manicured hand, told me to rest my tired bones, and swept out of the room. A few minutes later, I heard the heavy thud of her SUV doors locking and the tires crunching down the driveway. The house was finally empty. I dragged myself out of bed and limped heavily toward the back of the house. I unlocked the sliding glass door leading to the patio. Less than 10 minutes later, a shadow moved swiftly across the dew-covered grass. The back gate creaked open softly. Jasmine stepped onto the patio. She stood frozen in the doorway, staring at me. I knew exactly what she was seeing. I used to be a towering, barrel-chested man who could lift a shipping crate strap without breaking a sweat. Now I was leaning heavily on a wooden cane, my left side drooping, my face lined with exhaustion and pain. Jasmine dropped her heavy leather briefcase onto the hardwood floor and rushed forward. She threw her arms around my neck, holding me so tightly I could feel her own heart racing against my chest. We stood there in the quiet kitchen, a father and daughter, finally bridging a 15-year divide with silent, healing tears. There were no arguments about the past. There were no accusations. In that singular moment, we were family, and we were going to war. Jasmine wiped her eyes, took a deep, stabilizing breath, and shifted instantly into her element. She was a senior forensic accountant for a massive corporate firm, a woman who spent her days dismantling complex financial fraud for a living. She hauled her heavy briefcase onto my kitchen table and pulled out a sleek, high-powered laptop. She asked for my union identification number, my social security card, and the exact date I opened my primary checking accounts. I handed her my worn leather wallet. Valerie had changed all my digital passwords, locking me out of my own life. But Jasmine knew exactly how to bypass the surface-level security. She dialed a direct back-channel number to the fraud department of my banking institution, utilizing her corporate credentials and my physical presence on the line to force a hard reset of my primary accounts. Within 20 minutes, the glowing screen of her laptop was flooded with 5 years of my complete financial history. I stood leaning heavily against the kitchen island, watching my daughter's eyes narrow as her fingers flew across the keyboard. The rhythmic clacking of the keys was the only sound in the room. Her expression grew darker and more intense with every passing minute. What she uncovered was infinitely worse than a simple retirement account drain. It was a massive, sophisticated criminal enterprise. Valerie had not just taken cash from the ATM. She had established a series of fraudulent limited liability companies registered in Delaware. She had been systematically siphoning my hard-earned pension and my union disability payouts into these shell corporations, classifying the thefts as consulting expenses to avoid triggering the bank's automated fraud alerts. From Delaware, the funds were wired directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and then quietly funneled into a private banking institution in Montego Bay, Jamaica. Jasmine pulled up the escrow documents for my house. She traced the routing numbers attached to the pending Friday sale. Valerie and DeAndre had structured the real estate transaction so that the $900,000 cash payment would bounce through a domestic holding account for exactly 2 hours before being irrevocably wired into the Jamaican trust fund. Jasmine turned the laptop screen toward me, her face pale, but her jaw set with absolute furious determination. She explained that Valerie had crossed a massive, irreversible line. By forging the power of attorney and routing stolen funds through domestic shell companies to an offshore account, she was no longer just a greedy spouse committing a civil dispute. She had committed multiple counts of premeditated federal wire fraud. It was a severe federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I felt a surge of righteous anger burning in my chest. I reached for my cane, my voice hardening. I told Jasmine to call the police right this very second. I wanted squad cars in my driveway. I wanted Valerie arrested the minute she pulled her expensive SUV back into the garage. I wanted my house secured and my life back. But Jasmine reached out and firmly placed her hand over mine, stopping me dead in my tracks. She looked at me with a cold, calculating brilliance that reminded me so much of her late grandmother. She explained the harsh reality of the legal trap. If we called the local police right now, Valerie would be arrested for the forged document, but the financial damage was already done. The hundreds of thousands of dollars she had already stolen and moved offshore would be tied up in international jurisdictional battles for a decade. Valerie could easily hire a slick defense attorney, claim she was simply moving marital assets to prepare for my long-term medical care, and possibly secure bail. If she got out on bail, she would immediately empty the offshore accounts, flee the country, and disappear into the Caribbean with the man she had been financing with my blood and sweat. We would win the house, but we would lose the war. Jasmine outlined the only strategy that guaranteed absolute total destruction. The federal authorities needed the final, undeniable act of the house sale to lock the trap permanently. We needed the real estate transaction to reach the closing table. We needed Valerie to willingly sign the final federal wire transfer documents in front of a licensed escrow officer. The moment her pen touched that paper, she would legally cement her federal crimes beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt, and the federal injunction Jasmine was preparing would instantly freeze the offshore routing numbers, trapping every single stolen dime before it could leave the country. I stared at my brilliant daughter, feeling the immense gravity of her words settling over me. To execute this plan, I had to willingly walk straight into the jaws of the beast. I had to let Valerie put me in that transport van on Tuesday morning. I had to let her believe she had won, let her pack my bags, let her banish me to a state-funded lockdown facility, swallowing the agonizing humiliation of my physical weakness. I had to sit in the dark for 3 more days, enduring her fake smiles and DeAndre's cruel mockery, knowing that the very fate of my entire life's work depended on my ability to play the broken, defeated old man. I tightened my grip on the carved handle of my wooden cane. I looked around the beautiful kitchen I had built, feeling the ghost of my 30 years of labor standing right beside me. I looked back at Jasmine, gave a slow, deliberate nod, and told her to set the trap. We were going to let Valerie proceed to the closing table. We were going to let her taste the victory right up until the exact second we shattered her entire world. Monday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky that perfectly matched the cold, heavy concrete settling in my chest. Jasmine had slipped out through the back gate hours before sunrise, leaving me completely alone in the massive, quiet house. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady rhythm, pushing a chill through the bedroom vents that made my stiff joints ache. I lay flat on my back, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling plaster. Tuesday was the day. Tomorrow was the day Valerie planned to have me loaded into a transport van and shipped off to a state-funded lockdown facility for the elderly. Today, she had to finalize the legal paperwork to make that nightmare a reality. The final pieces of her elaborate trap were being moved across the board, and I had to become the exact pathetic creature she needed me to be. For a man who had spent his entire adult life standing tall, providing and protecting, pretending to be broken is a bitter pill to swallow. I am a proud black man. I survived 30 years on the brutal Savannah docks hauling freight in the freezing rain and the blistering southern heat. I built my life on strength, on resilience, and on the undeniable fact that my family could always lean on my broad shoulders. To voluntarily strip away that dignity, to look into the eyes of the woman who was actively trying to destroy me and play the role of a drooling, defeated fool required a level of mental fortitude I never knew I possessed. But pride is exactly what gets a man killed. Patience and calculated silence are what get a man justice. I spent the early morning hours practicing my performance. I let my lower jaw slacken just a fraction. I practiced making my eyes look glassy, vacant, and completely lost to the world. I remembered the old dock workers I had seen over the years who had suffered massive brain trauma from cargo accidents. I remembered how they would look right through you as if the lights were on, but nobody was home. I channeled every ounce of that tragic emptiness into my own expression. Around 10 in the morning, the brass handle of my bedroom door finally turned. Valerie walked into the room carrying a small silver tray. She was dressed impeccably, wearing a tailored navy blue dress and a string of expensive pearls I had bought for her on our 20th anniversary. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she smelled strongly of premium floral perfume. She looked like a woman preparing for a celebratory luncheon at a high-end country club, not a woman preparing to sell her husband down the river. The absolute sheer contrast between her elegant, beautiful exterior and the rotting darkness of her soul made my stomach physically churn. She set the tray down on my nightstand. It held a bowl of bland, lukewarm oatmeal and a tiny plastic cup containing my severely rationed blood pressure and pain medication. She sat gracefully on the edge of my mattress, smoothing the heavy quilt over my legs with a terrifying, theatrical tenderness. She spoke to me in a high-pitched, soothing voice usually reserved for calming a frightened toddler. She asked me how I was feeling on this beautiful morning and if I was ready for a very important day. I forced the muscles in my face to remain completely slack. I blinked slowly, staring past her shoulder at the blank wall. I mumbled a weak, unintelligible response, letting my words slur heavily together. I reached out for the small plastic cup of water on the tray, using my good right hand, but I intentionally let my fingers tremble violently. I knocked the cup over, spilling the cold water directly onto my chest and the clean bedsheets. I wanted to test my performance. I wanted to see her raw, unfiltered reaction. For a fraction of a second, the sweet, doting wife mask slipped entirely. Pure, unadulterated disgust flashed across her dark brown eyes. Her lips thinned into a tight, angry line as she quickly snatched a towel from the bathroom to wipe up the mess. She muttered something under her breath about how I was making everything so incredibly difficult. But just as quickly as the mask had slipped, she pulled it right back into place. She forced a bright artificial smile and told me it was perfectly fine and that accidents happen to sick people. She then leaned in close, her perfume suffocating the air around me. She told me she had a very special guest coming over to the house to help with some routine hospital paperwork. She claimed the insurance company needed a simple signature to ensure my premium care continued at a specialized physical therapy center. The lies slid off her tongue like sweet, poisonous honey. She patted my cheek, told me to eat my cold oatmeal, and glided out of the room to wait for her accomplice. The wait was pure psychological torture. I knew exactly what kind of paperwork was walking through my front door. It was not a medical transfer. It was the final validation of the forged power of attorney and the custodial surrender forms that would give her absolute, undisputed legal control over my physical body and my remaining financial assets. A little before noon, the front doorbell chimed, echoing loudly through the quiet house. I heard Valerie greeting someone in the foyer with a cheerful, enthusiastic tone. Heavy, unfamiliar footsteps approached my bedroom door. Valerie walked in, followed closely by a man who looked absolutely nothing like a legitimate medical professional or a respectable legal officer. He was a short, balding man, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and strong peppermint cologne. He carried a scuffed black leather briefcase under his arm. His eyes darted nervously around the expensive master bedroom, taking in the custom mahogany furniture and the large flat-screen television on the wall. Valerie introduced him as Mr. Davis, a regional representative from the State Health Registry. I knew instantly what he truly was. He was a paid-off, shady notary public. He was a bottom feeder, a man willing to blindly place his official state stamp on blatantly forged documents for a few $100s in an unmarked envelope. He did not look at me with any shred of human compassion. He did not see a man who had built a life and a family. He looked at my crippled body and saw nothing but a quick, easy payday. Valerie pulled a padded armchair right up to the edge of my bed and gestured for Mr. Davis to sit. He popped the latches on his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I could see the bold black text at the top of the pages, identifying them as irrevocable custodial transfers and financial proxy validations. Valerie gently took my good right hand, holding it softly between both of hers. She looked deep into my eyes and pitched her elaborate lie with Oscar-winning conviction. She told me that the doctors had found a wonderful, beautiful rehabilitation center that was going to help me walk again. She said the facility required my signature to release my medical records and to authorize the insurance payments. She spoke slowly, clearly, enunciating every single word as if she were guiding a confused child through a simple task. This was the moment. The absolute hardest acting job of my entire life began right then and there. I had to look into the eyes of the woman orchestrating my total destruction and pretend I believed every single poisonous word she said. Mr. Davis clicked a heavy black ink pen and extended it toward me. I reached out slowly. I let my arm shake so violently that the pen slipped right through my fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. Mr. Davis let out a sharp, annoyed sigh, clearly impatient to get his money and leave. Valerie quickly scooped the pen off the floor and placed it firmly back into my palm, closing my fingers around the cool plastic. Her grip was incredibly tight, her fingernails digging painfully into my skin, a silent, terrifying warning to stop delaying the process. I looked up at her face. I let genuine tears well up in my eyes. They were not tears of fear or confusion. They were tears born from the profound, heartbreaking reality that 30 years of marriage, 30 years of absolute loyalty and backbreaking sacrifice had amounted to this single miserable moment of betrayal. I let the hot tears spill over my eyelids and run down my weathered cheeks. I stammered her name, my voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. I asked her why I had to leave my beautiful house. I asked her if I was dying. I begged her not to send me away to a place filled with strangers. I made myself look utterly broken, terrified, and completely dependent on her mercy. Mr. Davis shifted uncomfortably in his chair, looking away and checking his gold wristwatch. He clearly did not want to witness the emotional destruction of the man he was helping to rob. But Valerie did not look away. She did not flinch. She simply leaned down, her face inches from mine. She reached out and casually brushed a tear from my cheek. Her eyes were completely dead, devoid of any soul or conscience. She whispered to me in a voice so cold, it practically froze the air in my lungs. She told me not to cry. She said it was going to be absolutely beautiful where I was going. And then she looked me dead in the center of my eyes and said, "God has a plan for all of us, Calvin. You just need to trust me." She actually brought God into her filthy, treacherous scheme. The sheer absolute blasphemy of her words almost made me break character. A violent surge of pure rage sparked in my chest, urging me to grab her by the throat and throw her out of my house. But I swallowed the fire burning in my throat. I looked down at the stack of legal papers resting on my lap. I took a deep, trembling breath. I pressed the pen to the signature line. Instead of writing my actual smooth signature, I dragged the pen awkwardly across the paper, creating a jagged, messy, barely legible scribble that looked absolutely nothing like my real handwriting. I repeated the pathetic scribble on the next 3 pages, intentionally letting the pen slip off the signature line on the final document. Mr. Davis immediately snatched the paperwork back from my lap before the ink was even dry. He did not bother to check if the signatures matched any official identification. He simply pulled a heavy metal stamp from his briefcase and pressed it firmly onto the bottom of each page. The loud, rhythmic thud of the notary stamp echoing in the quiet bedroom sounded exactly like nails being driven into a coffin. He nodded sharply at Valerie, slipping the documents back into his briefcase and snapping the latches shut. The deal was officially done. She had the legal ammunition she needed to lock me away and proceed with the massive offshore wire transfer. Valerie stood up, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in her expensive navy blue dress. She did not offer me another word of comfort. The performance was over, and I had served my final purpose. She escorted Mr. Davis out of the bedroom, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind her. I listened to their footsteps echoing down the hallway. I heard the muffled sound of the front door opening and closing. Valerie did not return to check on me. She walked straight to the kitchen. I could hear the faint sound of her opening a bottle of wine, celebrating her perceived victory. She was likely preparing to call her secret Jamaican lover to tell him the final obstacle had been removed from their path to paradise. The house fell completely silent again. I lay there in the bed, staring at the closed door. I reached up with the back of my hand and roughly wiped the fake drool and the real tears from my face. My heart was pounding with a fierce, relentless energy. I rolled over and reached my arm deep under the heavy mattress. My fingers found the cold, bulky plastic of the prepaid burner phone Jasmine had left for me. I pulled it out and rested it on my chest. The digital screen was entirely dark. I waited in the silence. Every single minute that ticked by felt like an agonizing hour. I needed to know that the trap outside these walls was successfully set. I needed to know that my performance had not been in vain. The afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across the bedroom floor. My breathing was shallow, my eyes locked onto the black screen of the phone. Suddenly, the bulky device vibrated violently in my palm, emitting a short, quiet buzz. The screen lit up, filling the dim room with a harsh, bright glow. I fumbled with the rubber buttons, pulling up the single new text message. It was from a completely untraceable number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end. I read the glowing words in the dark room, my chest expanding with a massive breath of relief. The message was short, precise, and absolutely devastating. It read, "The lawyer is secured. We intercepted the escrow account. Let her sign the papers." The glowing screen of the prepaid burner phone cast a harsh blue light across my calloused hands in the pitch-black darkness of the master bedroom. I read the text message from my daughter Jasmine over and over again, letting the sheer magnitude of her words wash over me. She had intercepted the escrow account. The lawyer was secured. We were going to let Valerie sign the closing papers. I pressed the small rubber power button, plunging the room back into absolute darkness, and rested the heavy plastic device flat against my chest. For the first time since my stroke, a profound sense of clarity replaced the suffocating terror that had been gripping my lungs. I was no longer a helpless invalid waiting for the slaughter. I was the bait in a meticulously constructed federal trap. Over the next 48 hours, my burner phone vibrated with brief encrypted updates from Jasmine. She had not just hired any run-of-the-mill family attorney to handle a simple divorce dispute. My brilliant daughter had secured the services of Jackson Cole, a former state prosecutor who specialized exclusively in high-level elder financial abuse and corporate fraud. Jasmine and Mr. Cole had spent the entire weekend digging through the digital footprint of Valerie's offshore shell companies. They had connected every single dot, and the picture they painted was a masterpiece of criminal arrogance. Mr. Cole explained the legal mechanics to me through Jasmine's texts. He called it the fruit of the poisonous tree. Because Valerie had brazenly forged my signature on the original legal power of attorney document, every single action she took after that moment was fundamentally illegal. Every dollar she moved from my retirement accounts to cover DeAndre's gambling debts was a distinct count of theft. Every shell company she established in Delaware constituted corporate fraud. But the absolute golden ticket was the pending sale of our $900,000 home. By signing the final real estate deeds under a fraudulent proxy and actively attempting to wire those massive funds to an offshore bank account in Jamaica, she was elevating her crimes from state-level domestic theft to federal wire fraud and international money laundering. If we had called the local patrol officers on Sunday, they would have simply arrested her for the forged notary stamp. She would have posted a modest bail, hired a slick defense attorney, and drained whatever liquid cash she had already successfully moved offshore. She would have dragged me through a decade of agonizing civil litigation while living comfortably in her tropical paradise. But Mr. Cole had a much more destructive strategy. We had to let her commit the ultimate felony. We had to wait for her to sit down at that mahogany table inside the real estate office on Friday morning and physically sign the federal wire transfer authorizations. The exact second the ink from her pen dried on those documents, the trap would violently snap shut. A federal injunction would immediately freeze every single routing number associated with her name. She would be completely cornered with absolutely no legal escape route and a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary waiting for her. But to secure that cinematic victory, I had to survive the brutal realities of the present moment. I had to endure the agonizing humiliation of my own perceived defeat. Monday morning crept into the house like a thick, suffocating fog. The atmosphere inside the walls was incredibly tense. Tuesday was the day Valerie had scheduled my forced transfer to the state-funded lockdown facility. As the deadline rapidly approached, the pressure began to visibly crack DeAndre's arrogant facade. DeAndre was pacing the hardwood floors of the hallway outside my bedroom like a trapped wild animal. Through the thin drywall, I could hear the constant frantic buzzing of his cell phone. His underground bookies were clearly running out of patience. He would answer the calls, speaking in hushed, desperate tones, begging for just a few more days, promising that a massive payday was guaranteed by the end of the week. The sheer terror in his voice was palpable. He was a cowardly boy playing a highly dangerous game with ruthless men, and his only lifeline was the successful theft of my entire life savings. His mounting panic quickly morphed into raw, physical aggression. Around 3 in the afternoon, my bedroom door was kicked open with tremendous force. DeAndre stormed into the room, holding a stack of cheap, thin plastic garbage bags. He looked down at me lying in the bed, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his jaw clenched in a tight, furious grimace. He threw the plastic bags directly onto my chest, demanding that I get my junk together. He told me the transport van was arriving first thing in the morning, and he wanted me completely packed and ready to be thrown out the door without a single delay. I moved slowly, forcing my paralyzed left leg to drag across the heavy quilt. I reached out for my wooden cane, my hand trembling perfectly, playing the role of the terrified, helpless old man. I asked him in a weak, slurred voice where they were sending me. I begged him to let me speak to his mother. DeAndre let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed off the bedroom walls. He stepped right up to the edge of the mattress, towering over my seated frame. He told me his mother was completely done dealing with a useless, crippled burden. He said I was going to a place where they lock the doors from the outside and serve pureed carrots 3 times a day. He demanded that I stand up and start filling the garbage bags with my clothes right that very second. I gripped the carved handle of my wooden cane and slowly pushed myself upright. My stiff joints ached, and my left foot dragged heavily across the carpet. I reached into the mahogany dresser I had bought with my first union bonus check, pulling out a handful of worn cotton shirts. I moved with agonizing slowness, intentionally testing his severely frayed patience. DeAndre snapped. The stress of his massive gambling debts and the impending reality of his criminal actions finally boiled over into physical violence. He lunged forward, grabbing a fistful of my loose flannel shirt. He violently shoved me backward. The sheer force of his push sent me stumbling. The wooden cane slipped from my grasp, clattering loudly against the baseboards. I fell hard backward, crashing heavily into the padded armchair sitting in the corner of the room. A sharp, blinding spike of agony shot directly up my paralyzed left hip, radiating all the way to my lower spine. I gasped out loud, clutching my side as the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. DeAndre stood over me, his chest heaving, his fists tightly clenched at his sides. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and told me to sit there and keep my mouth shut while he packed my miserable bags himself. He began violently yanking my clothes from the hangers, throwing my shoes and trousers haphazardly into the black plastic garbage bags, treating the physical remnants of my 30 years of hard labor like absolute trash. I sat slumped in that armchair staring at the floor. My own fists were clenched so tightly, my fingernails were biting deeply into the tough, calloused skin of my palms. For 30 years, I had hauled heavy steel cables and massive wooden pallets on the unforgiving Savannah docks. I possessed a thick, deep-rooted blue-collar strength that a soft, entitled boy like DeAndre could never possibly comprehend. Even sitting there recovering from a stroke, I knew with absolute certainty that I could easily reach up, grab his wrist, and snap his arm like a dry winter twig. Every single masculine instinct in my body screamed at me to rise from that chair, to defend my dignity, to strike him down for daring to put his hands on the man who had fed and clothed him for his entire life. But I kept my head bowed. I stared at the intricate pattern woven into the carpet and forced myself to swallow the burning, acidic taste of my own righteous pride. If I fought back, If I showed him even a fraction of my true remaining strength, the entire operation would be completely compromised. He would realize I was not a broken invalid. He would alert Valerie, and they would instantly change their timeline. I had to let him win this small, pathetic battle so I could utterly destroy his entire existence in the final war. I slowly unclenched my heavy fists, letting my hands rest limply on my lap. I closed my eyes and allowed a single fake tear to slide down my cheek, playing the role of the defeated patriarch to absolute perfection. DeAndre sneered at me, tied the garbage bags into tight knots, and stormed out of the bedroom, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. Tuesday morning arrived with a bitter, chilling wind blowing through the Georgia pines. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Valerie finally graced my bedroom with her presence. She was dressed in a soft beige cashmere sweater, sets her makeup applied with flawless precision. She carried a small cup of decaffeinated tea and a single generic pain pill. She sat on the edge of the mattress, looking at the black garbage bags piled near the door. She offered me a gentle, sorrowful smile that made my stomach churn with sheer revulsion. She stroked my hair, telling me how incredibly difficult this decision was for her. She claimed her heart was completely broken, but that my medical needs had simply become far too overwhelming for her to handle alone. She lied with such natural, effortless grace that it was genuinely terrifying to witness. She told me the state facility was beautiful, that the nurses were kind, and that she would come visit me every single Sunday after church. I knew there would be no Sunday visits. By Sunday, she fully intended to be sitting on a white sand beach in Montego Bay, sipping expensive cocktails with a Jamaican man, while I rotted away in a forgotten lockdown ward. I nodded slowly, offering no verbal resistance. I allowed her to help me button a cheap, worn-out cardigan over my shoulders. I gripped my wooden cane and leaned heavily against her arm as we began the slow, agonizing walk down the hallway. Every step toward the front door felt like a monumental effort. DeAndre was waiting in the foyer, leaning against the front door frame with his arms crossed over his chest. He did not offer to help me. He simply kicked the black plastic garbage bags out onto the front porch with the toe of his designer sneakers. Valerie pulled the heavy oak front door open. The cold morning air hit my face sharply. I stood on the top step of the porch, looking out at the circular driveway. A large, unmarked white transport van was idling softly near the curb. Its windows were heavily tinted, hiding the interior completely from view. The neighborhood was quiet, but I knew the retired folks across the street were likely watching through their front blinds. Valerie knew this too. She placed a supporting arm around my waist, guiding me carefully down the brick steps, putting on a masterful public performance of a grieving, dedicated wife, sending her beloved husband away to receive specialized medical care. We reached the back doors of the white van. The heavy diesel engine rumbled with a low, steady vibration. Valerie turned to face me. She reached up with both hands, gently cupping my weathered face. She manufactured a few highly convincing tears, letting them pool beautifully in her dark eyes. She leaned forward and pressed a soft, lingering kiss against my rough cheek. She whispered directly into my ear, telling me she loved me and that I would be perfectly safe now. I looked deep into her eyes. I saw the pure, unadulterated greed hiding just beneath the surface of her fake sorrow. I offered her a weak, trembling smile, letting my lower lip quiver. I told her I understood. The driver of the van stepped out from behind the steering wheel and walked around to the back of the vehicle. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, wearing a dark uniform jacket and a thick navy blue baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He did not say a single word. He simply grabbed the black plastic garbage bags containing my clothes and tossed them effortlessly into the back of the transport. Valerie stepped backward, giving the driver a crisp, professional nod. She handed him a manila folder containing the fraudulent transfer documents and the forged medical proxy forms. She turned around and began walking back up the brick pathway toward the massive, beautiful house I had built for her. She did not look back over her shoulder, not even once. She walked through the front door and closed it firmly, shutting me entirely out of the life I had financed with 30 years of my own blood. I stood alone on the pavement, leaning heavily on my cane. The driver stepped forward, placing a strong, steady hand under my right elbow to help me climb into the back of the van. The interior was dark, the seats covered in heavy-duty vinyl. I sank into the first row, dropping my cane onto the rubber floor mats. The heavy metal doors of the van slammed shut, plunging the cabin into the dim light of the tinted windows. The driver walked around to the front and climbed into the driver's seat. He put the vehicle into gear and slowly pulled away from the curb, steering us out of the wealthy suburban neighborhood and onto the main commercial highway. We drove in complete silence for 3 miles. I watched the familiar landscape of my neighborhood fade away through the dark glass. I was officially a ghost. Valerie believed she had successfully discarded my physical body, matching the legal erasure she had executed days prior. She was currently standing in my kitchen, celebrating the absolute perfection of her criminal masterpiece, completely unaware that she had just handed me the very weapon I would use to destroy her. The van merged onto the interstate, picking up speed. The driver reached up and pulled the heavy navy blue baseball cap off his head, tossing it onto the passenger seat. He turned his head slightly, looking back at me through the rearview mirror. A wide, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a face I had not seen in person for over 5 years. It was David, Jasmine's husband. He looked at me in the mirror, his eyes shining with a fierce, protective pride. He told me it was incredibly good to finally see me again and asked if I was ready to go to war. I leaned back against the vinyl seat, completely abandoning the frail, trembling posture I had maintained for the past 5 days. I stretched my legs out, feeling the cool air of the van wash over my tired bones. I looked right back at my son-in-law in the mirror and allowed a slow, dangerous smile to finally break across my face. I told him I had never been more ready for anything in my entire miserable life. The hardest part of the performance was officially over. Valerie had played her hand exactly as we anticipated. She was alone in the house, eagerly counting down the hours until her Friday morning real estate closing. She thought she had successfully locked me away in a state facility to rot. She had absolutely no idea that the transport van was currently speeding toward a private, secure hotel room where my daughter and a ruthless federal prosecutor were waiting for me with a massive stack of federal injunctions. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and I was going to let her walk right into the upscale real estate office on Friday morning. I was going to let her smile, let her pick up the pen, and let her taste the millions she thought she had stolen. And then I was going to walk through those conference room doors and burn her entire world straight to the ground. The Friday morning sun broke over the sleek glass high-rises of the Buckhead Financial District, casting a blinding golden glare across the busy Atlanta streets. I was not waking up on a thin plastic mattress in a state-funded lockdown ward. I was not eating cold mashed peas from a paper tray while heavily medicated and stripped of my basic human rights. I was sitting in a plush leather executive chair inside the private conference room of the most prestigious real estate brokerage in the city. I was wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit that my beautiful daughter Jasmine had purchased for me just 2 days prior. My back was perfectly straight. My mind was razor sharp, and the wooden cane resting against my knee was no longer a symbol of my physical defeat, but a testament to my survival. We were sitting in conference room B. The walls separating us from the main closing room were made of thick, heavy frosted glass. I could not see clearly through the opaque barrier, but I did not need to. Resting right in the center of our polished mahogany table was a small black digital audio receiver. Jackson Cole, the ruthless federal prosecutor Jasmine had brought into our war room, sat casually across from me. He was a tall, imposing man with a calm, calculating demeanor that radiated absolute authority. He was calmly sipping a cup of black coffee, his eyes locked onto his glowing laptop screen, tracking the digital movements of the escrow accounts. Jasmine sat directly to my left. She held my calloused hand in a firm, unyielding grip. We were a ghost team operating entirely in the shadows, waiting patiently for the prey to walk willingly into the steel teeth of our trap. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the brokerage lobby swung open. Through the frosted glass partition, I saw two blurred silhouettes strut into the reception area. The audio receiver on our table crackled to life, picking up the crisp, ambient sounds of the front desk. I heard Valerie's voice ringing out clear and bright, dripping with an absolute sickening confidence. She cheerfully announced her arrival to the receptionist, stating she was there for the Carter estate closing. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the reality of her audacity wash over me. I could picture exactly how they looked. They were undoubtedly dressed to the nines, wearing designer clothes, purchased with the very money she had secretly siphoned from my retirement accounts. DeAndre was likely wearing one of his flashy tailored jackets and a diamond-encrusted watch, strutting around as if he were a self-made millionaire instead of a lazy gambling addict drowning in underground debts. Valerie would be wearing her finest pearls, portraying the image of a wealthy, sophisticated matriarch, handling her family's complex financial affairs. They believed they were the smartest people in the entire city. They believed they had flawlessly executed the perfect crime. They had absolutely no idea that their every footstep was being monitored by federal authorities. The receptionist politely escorted them into Conference Room A, right next door to our hidden bunker. I listened to the sound of the heavy wooden chairs pulling back as they made themselves comfortable. A bright, bubbly assistant entered their room asking if they would care for some refreshments to celebrate the big successful sale. Valerie, with zero hesitation, requested 2 glasses of their finest chilled champagne. I sat in the adjacent room listening to the delicate clink of crystal flutes touching together. I heard DeAndre let out a low, greedy chuckle, toasting to the good life and the endless sunny beaches of Jamaica. My chest tightened with a profound, righteous fury. I thought about the 30 agonizing years I had spent working on the Savannah shipping docks. I thought about the freezing winter mornings, loading heavy freight sauce until my hands bled. I thought about the blistering summer afternoons, where the heat radiating off the asphalt felt like an open oven. I had broken my spine, I had destroyed my knees, and I had sacrificed my own youth to provide a beautiful paid-off home for that woman. And there she was, sitting less than 15 feet away from me, cheerfully drinking expensive champagne and toasting to my absolute destruction. She was celebrating the fact that she was about to wire my life savings to a secret lover on a tropical island while leaving me completely destitute and locked away in a miserable cage. Jackson Cole looked up from his laptop screen and caught my eye. He gave me a slow, steady nod, silently reminding me to hold my ground. We could not interrupt them yet. We could not burst through those frosted glass doors and demand justice prematurely. The legal mechanics of our trap required absolute patience. Because Valerie had forged my signature on the original power of attorney document, every single subsequent action she took was tainted with fraud. But we needed the final definitive strike. We needed her to physically sign the federal wire transfer authorizations in the presence of a licensed escrow officer. The exact second her pen completed that signature, she would cement her federal crimes, elevating her actions from simple domestic theft to international money laundering and wire fraud. We needed her to cross the point of no return. The heavy door of Conference Room A opened again. The lead escrow officer walked in, introducing himself as Mr. Harrison. He had a smooth, professional voice perfectly suited for handling high-net-worth transactions. He congratulated Valerie on the incredibly fast off-market cash sale of the property. He noted that a $900,000 all-cash closing was a fantastic achievement in the current economic climate. Valerie thanked him graciously, her tone dripping with false humility. She smoothly explained that it was a very bittersweet moment for her family. I gripped the armrests of my leather chair so tightly, my knuckles turned completely white. I listened as Valerie launched into her practiced theatrical sob story. She told Mr. Harrison that her poor beloved husband had suffered a catastrophic stroke. She claimed that my mental faculties had deteriorated so rapidly that she was forced to move me into a specialized full-time care facility just 2 days ago. She sighed a deep, sorrowful sigh, telling the escrow officer that the medical bills were simply astronomical, and she was making the heartbreaking sacrifice of selling our beautiful family estate just to ensure I received the proper care I desperately needed. The sheer magnitude of her deception was breathtaking. She was sitting in a luxury office weaving a tragic tale of marital devotion while actively stealing my home to fund a secret Jamaican villa. DeAndre chimed in, playing the role of the supportive son, claiming that it was a tough week for his poor mother, but they were staying strong through the tragedy. I felt Jasmine squeeze my hand tightly, silently grounding me, keeping my rising anger completely in check. We listened as Mr. Harrison offered his deepest sympathies, totally falling for their flawless performance. Mr. Harrison shuffled his stack of paperwork, clearing his throat as he shifted into the official business of the morning. He explained the comprehensive closing process, outlining the massive stack of deeds, transfer disclosures, and tax affidavits sitting on the table. He told Valerie that since she was acting as the sole legal proxy under the notarized power of attorney, she would be required to initial every single page and sign the final binding agreements on my behalf. The tension in our hidden room spiked to an electrifying level. Jackson Cole leaned closer to the audio receiver, his eyes completely focused. Jasmine was holding her breath, staring at the frosted glass partition as if she could burn a hole straight through it with her sheer willpower. The trap was incredibly close to snapping shut. I listened to the steady, rhythmic scratching of Valerie's expensive fountain pen moving across the thick parchment paper. Page after page, document after document, she was systematically signing away the foundation of my entire life. Mr. Harrison guided her through the massive stack, pointing out the various legal clauses and holding account regulations. DeAndre was pacing back and forth in the background, clearly vibrating with a greedy, anxious energy. He interrupted the escrow officer twice, asking nervously how quickly the liquid funds would be released once the final signatures were applied. He was terrified his underground bookies would come looking for his kneecaps before the money safely cleared his offshore accounts. Mr. Harrison politely assured the anxious young man that because this was a verified all-cash transaction, the funds were already securely waiting in a domestic holding account. He explained that as soon as the final wire transfer authorization form was signed, the bank would immediately release the $900,000 to the specified routing numbers. We reached the final terrifying hurdle. Mr. Harrison pulled out the heavy wire transfer documents. He paused, his tone shifting slightly as he reviewed the specific banking details Valerie had provided. He noted that the primary routing number listed for the massive cash deposit was directed to an offshore trust account located in Montego Bay, Jamaica. He asked Valerie purely as a routine security measure to verbally confirm that this international routing was indeed the correct and intended destination for the estate funds. Valerie did not miss a single beat. Her voice was smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of hesitation. She confidently confirmed the offshore account, claiming it was a specialized international medical trust designed to handle overseas treatments and alternative therapies for my supposedly failing health. She spun the lie with such chilling perfection that even the seasoned escrow officer completely bought the narrative. He complimented her on being so incredibly thorough and prepared during such a difficult emotional time in her life. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of her lifting the pen for the final time. I pictured her sitting there wearing those beautiful pearls, smelling of that expensive perfume, looking at her son with a victorious, arrogant smirk. She truly believed she had won. She believed I was currently sitting in a locked beige room miles away, staring blankly at a wall, entirely powerless to stop her from taking everything I owned. She believed she had completely outsmarted a foolish old dock worker. The heavy scratching sound of her pen sweeping across the final dotted line echoed through the audio receiver. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a predator stepping blindly into a steel-jawed snare. Mr. Harrison cheerfully announced that the paperwork was officially complete. He congratulated them on a successful closing and stated he would now input the final signatures into the secure federal banking portal to initiate the immediate release of the offshore wire transfer. In our hidden room, Jackson Cole sharply tapped the enter key on his laptop, sending a synchronized digital command directly to the banking network. Jasmine let out a long, shaky breath, gripping my shoulder with a fierce, triumphant energy. I grabbed my wooden cane and slowly stood up from the leather executive chair. My legs were steady. My chest was full of air. The time for hiding in the shadows was completely over. Through the audio receiver, I heard the rapid clicking of Mr. Harrison typing on his computer keyboard. Valerie and DeAndre were clinking their champagne glasses together, letting out soft, celebratory laughs. They were practically tasting the warm Jamaican breeze. They were seconds away from walking out of that building as millionaires. Suddenly, the rapid typing in conference room A came to a dead stop. A heavy, confusing silence fell over the adjacent room. I heard Mr. Harrison let out a soft, perplexed sound. He tapped his keyboard a few more times, the clicking sounding incredibly loud in the sudden quiet. DeAndre asked him impatiently if there was some sort of technical problem with the internet connection. Valerie's voice lost a fraction of its smooth confidence as she demanded to know why the transfer confirmation receipt had not printed out yet. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, his professional demeanor faltering significantly. I heard the distinct sound of his chair rolling back from the desk. He spoke in a confused, highly concerned tone. "I am completely sorry, Mrs. Carter, but the banking portal is throwing up a massive red flag. This specific offshore routing number has just been forcefully frozen by a direct federal injunction. The system is showing an active block placed by the United States Department of Justice regarding severe fraudulent activity." I heard Valerie gasp a sharp, sudden intake of air. DeAndre cursed loudly, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he jumped to his feet, demanding to know what kind of insane joke the escrow officer was playing. Valerie's voice began to tremble completely, losing its elegant composure as she frantically insisted there must be a clerical error and demanded he force the wire transfer through immediately. Mr. Harrison spoke again, his voice dropping into a serious, bewildered tone. "I cannot override a federal banking freeze, Mrs. Carter, and the system alert states that the primary title holder of the estate is actually physically present in the building right now to legally contest this entire fraudulent sale." The absolute deafening silence that followed his statement was the most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. The heavy, solid brass handles of the double oak doors felt remarkably cool against the calloused skin of my right hand. For 5 grueling days, I had dragged my body through my own house like a wounded animal, playing the part of a broken, helpless old man. I had swallowed my pride, chewed on my own dignity, and let the woman I had loved for decades treat me like a piece of decaying garbage. But standing in that pristine, carpeted corridor outside Conference Room A, the act was officially over. I turned to my left and looked at my beautiful, brilliant daughter, Jasmine. She reached out, and silently took the sturdy wooden cane from my hand. I did not need it anymore. The fiery burning ache in my left hip had completely vanished, replaced by a rushing flood of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I rolled my broad shoulders back, expanding my chest, and taking in a massive lungful of the crisp, air-conditioned oxygen. I looked down at my immaculate charcoal gray Sunday suit. It was the armor of a man who had survived 30 years of brutal labor on the Savannah shipping docks. I was a proud black man, and I was about to take my life back. Flanking me on my right was Jackson Cole, the federal prosecutor. He stood tall and unyielding, holding the thick manila folder that contained the undeniable proof of my wife's international wire fraud. Standing directly behind us, forming an impenetrable human barricade, were three massive uniformed Atlanta police officers. The quiet hum of their shoulder radios and the heavy clinking of their utility belts created a symphony of impending justice. I gave Jackson a single, decisive nod. The time for hiding in the shadows of the adjacent room was done. I pushed the heavy oak doors forward with both hands. They swung inward with a loud, resounding groan that ripped through the cheerful, celebratory atmosphere of the boardroom like a thunderclap. I did not shuffle. I did not limp. I planted my dress shoes firmly onto the plush corporate carpet, walking with the exact same undeniable commanding authority I used to wield while directing heavy freight logistics on the coastal ports. I walked into the room standing absolutely tall, breathing deeply, radiating the quiet, terrifying strength of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The scene inside the boardroom froze in a glorious, perfect cinematic tableau. The sheer magnitude of the shock washing over the room was something I will savor until the day I take my final breath. Valerie and DeAndre were sitting comfortably at the massive polished mahogany table, completely surrounded by neat stacks of legal paperwork and thick premium escrow folders. A silver bucket sweating with condensation sat nearby, chilling a bottle of ridiculously expensive champagne. They both held delicate crystal flutes in their hands, their fingers wrapped elegantly around the stems mid-toast. They were actively celebrating my perceived demise. They were toasting to the $900,000 they believed they had just successfully stolen from my life savings. DeAndre was the very first person to process the visual reality of the situation. He looked up from his champagne glass, and his eyes locked onto my face. He expected to see a drooling, medicated invalid locked away in a state-funded transport van. Instead, he saw a towering, furious patriarch standing under his own power. His wide, bloodshot eyes darted past my shoulders, taking in the stern face of the federal prosecutor, and then landing directly on the three imposing uniformed police officers, blocking the only exit. The arrogant, cocky smirk completely vanished from his face, melting instantly into an expression of pure, unadulterated animal terror. He was wearing a ridiculously flashy designer jacket, bought with my stolen retirement funds, looking like a foolish little boy playing dress-up in a grown man's world. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the edge of the solid mahogany table and shattered into dozens of tiny, glittering pieces, spilling pale yellow liquor all over the expensive real estate documents and splashing onto the sleeves of his tailored jacket. The sudden sharp sound of the breaking glass shattered the frozen silence of the room. The realization of the federal trap hit DeAndre like a physical blow to the stomach. His survival instincts kicked in, entirely overriding whatever microscopic amount of loyalty he held for his mother. He scrambled backward, kicking his heavy leather executive chair away from the table with a loud, violent scrape. He spun around, frantically looking for an alternate escape route, a side door, a window, or a fire escape. Finding absolutely nothing but solid frosted glass, he made a pathetic, desperate dash toward the far side of the hallway corridor, trying to squeeze past to the federal barricade. He did not even make it 3 steps. The lead police officer, a towering man with arms like solid tree trunks, stepped smoothly and efficiently right into his path. The officer placed a massive, unyielding hand squarely against the center of DeAndre's chest, stopping his forward momentum instantly. With a swift, effortless shove, the officer pushed the cowardly boy backward. DeAndre stumbled, his expensive designer sneakers slipping awkwardly on the corporate carpet, and collapsed heavily back into his leather chair. He sat there, breathing in ragged, terrified gasps, completely neutralized, shrinking down into the upholstery, like a frightened child, realizing that the incredibly dangerous men he owed money to were suddenly the least of his problems. While DeAndre panicked, Valerie experienced a completely different kind of catastrophic system failure. I watched her perfectly manicured brain try to reboot and process the sheer impossibility standing right in front of her. She stared at my straight spine, at the clear, focused energy radiating from my dark eyes, at the complete and utter absence of my wooden cane. She looked at Jasmine standing fiercely by my side, the beautiful biological daughter she had spent 15 years trying to systematically erase from my life. She saw the ruthless federal prosecutor gripping the thick manila folder filled with her financial death warrants. And she saw the police officers securing the perimeter of the room, ensuring that she would never set foot on a Jamaican beach. For a fraction of a second, the sheer magnitude of her failure registered in her dark brown eyes. The tropical beachfront villa, the secret offshore bank accounts, the luxury lifestyle she had financed with my blood, sweat, and tears, all of it evaporated into thin air right before her eyes. The illusion she had spent years meticulously crafting was crumbling down around her shoulders. She was exposed. She was caught. She was entirely trapped in a web of her own making. But Valerie was a master manipulator, an apex predator, who refused to go down without deploying every single weapon in her toxic arsenal. I watched her physically force her facial features to soften. She swallowed hard, visibly burying her rising panic beneath a thick, suffocating layer of practiced theatrical sweetness. She placed her champagne glass carefully on the table, making sure her hands did not tremble. She stood up, smoothing the front of her elegant white designer dress. She took a tentative, delicate step toward me, her hands raised in a gesture of fake soothing concern. She opened her mouth, and the toxic honey poured out, attempting to coat the room in her usual sickening lies. She gasped loudly, placing a manicured hand gracefully over her heart, portraying the image of a deeply devoted, deeply shocked wife. She cried out my name using that high-pitched, patronizing tone she had used to humiliate me for months. "Calvin, baby," she gasped, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "You are supposed to be resting safely at the facility." She took another step forward, entirely ignoring the heavily armed police officers, pretending this was all just a massive, terrible medical misunderstanding. She looked at the escrow officer, Mr. Harrison, who was standing frozen behind his laptop, utterly bewildered by the sudden chaotic turn of events, and then she looked back at me. Her eyes widened with fake maternal worry. She told the room that I was severely confused, that my stroke-induced dementia was causing me to wander and hallucinate, and that I desperately needed to be taken back to my bed immediately for my own safety. She expected me to falter. She expected me to feel the familiar heavy weight of her manipulation and submit to her dominant will. She expected me to be the exact same blind, foolish old man who had handed over his financial accounts because he desperately wanted a peaceful household. She thought she could simply talk her way out of a federal wire fraud indictment by playing the role of the exhausted, suffering caretaker. But that blind, foolish man was completely dead. That man had died the moment I sat in the dark and watched the hidden camera footage of her drinking my expensive 20-year-old bourbon and laughing about throwing me into a state ward. I did not step back. I did not lower my gaze. I stood my ground like a massive ancient oak tree deeply rooted in the earth. I let her approach. I let her extend her trembling hand. And just before her manicured fingers could touch the fabric of my Sunday suit, I raised my own hand. It was a simple, silent gesture, but it carried the heavy, undeniable authority of a man who had spent 3 decades commanding absolute respect on the brutal coastal docks. Valerie froze instantly. Her hand hovered in the air, completely suspended by the sheer force of my silent command. The sweet, doting wife routine shattered against the absolute iron wall of my composure. The quiet in the boardroom was incredibly thick, broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing of her son sitting in the corner and the soft hum of the central air conditioning. She looked into my eyes, and she finally saw the truth. She saw that I knew everything. I stepped past her, moving purposefully toward the center of the massive mahogany table. The escrow officer, Mr. Harrison, quickly backed away, pressing himself against the frosted glass wall, recognizing that a monumental reckoning was unfolding in his office. I looked down at the neatly organized stacks of closing documents. I saw the fraudulent wire transfer forms. I saw the final dotted line where Valerie had just proudly signed her name, legally cementing her federal felony. She had willingly walked right into the jaws of the trap. Jasmine stepped forward, moving in perfect synchronization with me. My daughter, my blood, the woman who had driven 5 hours through the dark of night to save a father who had foolishly pushed her away, unzipped her heavy leather briefcase. She pulled out the ammunition we had meticulously gathered over the weekend. She handed the items to me one by one. I held the cold weight of the evidence in my calloused hands, feeling the incredible, undeniable power of absolute truth. I looked directly at Valerie, forcing her to turn around and meet my unwavering gaze. I raised my right hand and slammed a sleek silver iPad down onto the polished mahogany table. The loud, sharp crack of the metal hitting the wood echoed violently through the silent room, causing DeAndre to flinch in his chair. The screen of the iPad was illuminated, paused perfectly, on a high-definition freeze frame from the hidden camera. It clearly showed Valerie and DeAndre sitting in my living room, holding my forged estate documents and laughing hysterically about the offshore Jamaican accounts. Valerie stared at this glowing screen. The remaining color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking pale, sickly, and utterly terrified. Her perfectly styled hair suddenly seemed slightly out of place. Her expensive dress looked like a cheap costume. The reality of the surveillance footage completely destroyed any possibility of plausible deniability. I did not stop there. I raised my left hand and slammed a thick, heavy stack of printed paper directly next to the iPad. The sound cracked through the room like a whip. It was the complete, verified transcript of every single word they had spoken in front of that hidden camera. It detailed the massive gambling debts, the stolen retirement funds, the secret fiancé, and the precise calculated plan to lock me away in a medical facility while they stole my generational wealth. Finally, Jackson Cole stepped forward, moving with the smooth, lethal grace of a legal executioner. He placed the original notarized power of attorney document onto the table right on top of the transcripts. He spoke for the first time, his voice a deep, booming baritone that carried the absolute crushing weight of the federal justice system. He informed Valerie that the document she had used to authorize the estate sale was a verified forgery. He told her that by signing the closing papers and actively attempting to execute an international wire transfer of stolen funds, she had officially committed multiple counts of federal wire fraud and money laundering. He told her the offshore Jamaican accounts were already frozen by a direct federal injunction, and that she had absolutely nowhere left to run. Valerie began to physically shake. The elegant, sophisticated facade completely crumbled away, revealing the desperate, cornered thief hiding underneath. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another elaborate lie, to formulate another desperate excuse, but no sound came out. Her throat worked uselessly, her eyes darting frantically between the hard evidence on the table, the federal prosecutor delivering her fate, and the police officers blocking the door. She was suffocating under the immense crushing pressure of her own greed. I stepped around the mahogany table, closing the final distance between us. I invaded her personal space, looming over her, using my height and my broad shoulders to cast a heavy dark shadow across her trembling frame. I looked down into the eyes of the woman who had shared my bed, eaten my food, spent my hard-earned money, and ruthlessly plotted to erase my very existence. All the agonizing physical pain from the stroke, all the profound humiliation of pretending to be mindless, all the silent suffering I had endured over the past 5 days, culminated in this single glorious moment of absolute vindication. I leaned in incredibly close until I could smell the cold, metallic scent of fear radiating off her skin, entirely masking the scent of her Parisian perfume. My voice was no longer the weak, slurred whisper of a defeated stroke victim. It was deep, resonant, and dripping with 30 years of hard-earned grit and unyielding blue-collar pride. I rested for 30 years to build this life, Valerie. I am wide awake now. The words hung in the absolute stillness of the corporate boardroom. I stood there looking down at the woman who had shared my bed for years, watching the exact moment her entire universe collapsed. The silence was so profound, you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Valerie stared at me, her mouth slightly open, unable to form a single coherent sentence. The sleek silver iPad rested on the mahogany table between us, a glowing digital tombstone for her meticulously curated life of lies. The lead police officer stepped forward, breaking the spell. He was a massive man with a stern face and a voice that carried absolute authority. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. The metallic clinking sound echoed against the frosted glass walls of the conference room. He approached Valerie and instructed her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Valerie snapped out of her paralyzed state. She jerked her arms away, taking a frantic step backward until her expensive designer dress brushed against the leather chairs. She looked at the officer with wild, indignant eyes, protesting that this was a terrible mistake, that she was a respectable woman making medical decisions for her ailing husband. She tried to deploy the sweet, innocent routine one last time, but her voice cracked and pitched into a shrill, desperate frequency. The officer did not hesitate. He moved with swift, practiced efficiency, grabbing her left wrist and locking the cold steel cuff around it. At the exact same moment, the other 2 officers descended upon DeAndre. He was still slumped in his executive chair, staring blankly at the spilled champagne soaking into the forged real estate documents. An officer firmly ordered him to stand up. DeAndre scrambled to his feet, but his legs simply gave out beneath him. The arrogant, cocky young man who had laughed about my supposed dementia while draining my hard-earned retirement funds was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified little boy facing the catastrophic consequences of his own greed. The officers pulled DeAndre to his feet and slammed him against the frosted glass wall to secure his wrists. The heavy thud vibrated through the room. DeAndre began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, ugly, sobbing wail. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his carefully groomed appearance. He twisted his neck to look at me, his face contorted in pure panic. "Calvin, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "You have to tell them to stop. Please, man, I am sorry. I did not want to do this. She made me do it. I just needed some cash to clear my debts. You know I love you like a father. Please do not let them put me in a cage." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The anger that had burned inside my chest for the past 5 days had completely burned out, leaving only cold, solid iron. This boy had sat in my living room drinking my prized 20-year-old bourbon, toasting to the day I would be locked away in a state-funded ward so he could pay off his underground sports bets. I remembered the heavy, calloused feeling of my hands after a 30-hour shift on the Savannah shipping docks, working through the freezing rain to put food on the table for this very same ungrateful child. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The officers paused, holding him firmly against the glass. I looked deep into DeAndre's panicked, bloodshot eyes. My voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of any warmth. "Do not ever call me a father," I told him quietly. "You wanted to play grown man games with my blood money. You wanted to sit at the high roller table and gamble away the roof over my head. Well, the game is completely over, DeAndre. I am not the one you need to be begging for mercy. You better save those tears and ask your underground bookies for mercy, because the federal government is going to take every single dime you have left." DeAndre let out a loud, miserable sob, dropping his head onto the frosted glass as the officers finished tightening the handcuffs. He knew exactly what was waiting for him. Without the massive wire transfer from my house sale, the violent men he owed money to in the city would be waiting for him the second he posted bail. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. Across the room, Valerie was fighting a completely losing battle. The lead officer had secured both her wrists behind her back. The physical reality of the cold steel binding her hands finally shattered the last remaining fragments of her elegant facade. The poised, sophisticated matriarch vanished entirely. She transformed into a wild, cornered animal. She thrashed against the officer, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face turning a blotchy, angry shade of crimson. She locked her furious gaze on me. The fake sweetness was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated venom. She screamed that I could not do this to her. She screamed that she had given me the best years of her life, that she had tolerated my boring blue-collar existence and my stubborn, old-fashioned ways. She spat my name like a curse word, telling me that I was a cruel, vindictive monster for trapping her. Then she twisted her body toward Jackson Cole, the federal prosecutor, standing stoically at the edge of the mahogany table. She demanded her rights. She screamed that even if the power of attorney was deemed invalid, she was still legally my wife. She yelled at the top of her lungs that under state law she was entitled to half of everything I owned. She shrieked that half the house, half the retirement accounts, and half the assets belonged to her simply because her name was on our marriage certificate. She insisted that they could not freeze the escrow account because she had a legal right to her share of the $900,000 sale. Jackson Cole did not even blink. He adjusted his suit jacket and picked up the thick manila folder from the table. He looked at Valerie with the cold, detached, clinical gaze of a man who put white-collar criminals away for a living. His voice was smooth, professional, and absolutely devastating. "Mrs. Carter," he began, speaking clearly over her frantic shouting, "you seem to be operating under a severe misunderstanding of family law. While it is true that marital assets are generally divided in civil divorce proceedings, your situation is no longer a simple domestic dispute. You did not file for divorce. You filed fraudulent medical declarations. You forged a federal legal document. You attempted to execute an unauthorized international wire transfer to offshore accounts in Jamaica. You engaged in premeditated elder abuse and severe financial exploitation." He took a slow step toward her, tapping the manila folder with his index finger. "Under the specific statutes governing felony fraud and elder exploitation, your criminal actions completely and entirely void any marital claim you might have held to this property. You tried to steal the entire pie, Mrs. Carter. By doing so, you forfeited your right to even a single crumb. The state does not reward felony theft with a 50% payout. You own absolutely nothing. This house remains the sole property of Calvin Carter." The money remains in his accounts. The only thing you have secured today is a one-way ticket to a federal holding cell." Valerie stopped struggling. The legal reality of his words hit her with the crushing force of a freight train. She realized in that exact moment that there was no hidden loophole, no clever lawyer trick, no emotional manipulation that could save her. She had gambled my entire life and she had lost everything. Her knees gave out. She slumped downward, the heavy fabric of her white designer dress pooling on the corporate carpet. The lead officer had to physically support her weight to keep her from collapsing entirely onto the floor. She began to weep. It was a hollow, empty sound, completely devoid of genuine remorse. She was not crying for the pain she had caused me. She was not mourning the death of our 30-year marriage. She was weeping for the loss of her tropical Jamaican villa, for the secret lover she would never see again, and for the absolute destruction of her comfortable, wealthy lifestyle. Her perfectly curated world had shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The police officers began to move. They grabbed DeAndre by the arms and marched him toward the heavy oak doors. He kept his head bowed low, sobbing uncontrollably as they escorted him out of the boardroom. The lead officer hauled Valerie back to her feet. She looked at me one final time, her face streaked with mascara and ruined makeup. She opened her mouth to say something, but I simply turned my back on her, refusing to give her even a single second more of my time or my attention. I looked at the frosted glass wall, listening to the scuffling sound of her expensive heels dragging across the carpet as they led her away. Through the glass partition, I could see the chaos unfolding in the main lobby of the upscale brokerage. The receptionists, the wealthy clients, the sharp real estate agents, they all stopped what they were doing to witness the spectacle. Valerie and DeAndre were paraded right through the center of the pristine office, their hands bound behind their backs, their faces buried in shame. It was the ultimate public humiliation for a woman who cared about absolutely nothing more than her social image. The heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open and shut, and then they were finally permanently gone from my life. The profound silence that settled over Conference Room A was incredibly peaceful. It felt like walking out into the quiet calm after a massive, terrifying hurricane had finally passed. I turned back to the mahogany table. The escrow officer, Mr. Harrison, was still standing frozen against the wall, looking completely pale and visibly sweating. He was clutching a manila folder to his chest, looking at us as if we were dangerous undercover operatives. Jackson Cole walked over to him, speaking in a calm, reassuring tone. He explained that Mr. Harrison had done the right thing by complying with the federal freeze and that the brokerage would not be held liable for Valerie's deception. Jackson instructed the nervous escrow officer to immediately void all the signed documents sitting on the table. Mr. Harrison scrambled to comply, his hands shaking, as he took a large red rubber stamp and aggressively stamped the word "void" across every single page Valerie had just signed. He canceled the pending wire transfers, completely erasing the fraudulent transaction from the federal banking portal. My house, the sanctuary I had built with decades of grueling, backbreaking labor, was officially, legally, and securely mine again. I looked at Jackson Cole and extended my right hand. He shook it firmly, offering a rare, respectful smile. He told me that it was an absolute honor to help me secure my justice and that his office would handle the remaining criminal proceedings. I thanked him for giving me my life back. Then I turned to Jasmine. My beautiful, brilliant daughter stood there holding my wooden cane, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For 15 years, Valerie had whispered poison into my ear, convincing me that Jasmine was ungrateful, that she was selfish, that she wanted nothing to do with her old blue-collar father. Valerie had systematically isolated me from my own flesh and blood, wrapping me in a suffocating cocoon of manipulation. And yet, when I managed to sneak that one desperate phone call from my dark bedroom, Jasmine did not hesitate. She dropped everything, drove 5 hours through the night, and fought like a lioness to save me. I reached out and wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a fierce, tight embrace. She hugged me back, burying her face in the shoulder of my charcoal gray Sunday suit. I could feel her shaking slightly, the massive release of adrenaline and tension finally catching up to her. I closed my eyes, resting my chin on top of her head, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of her hair. I whispered my apologies into her ear. I apologized for being blind. I apologized for letting another woman drive a wedge between us. I apologized for missing so many years of her life. She squeezed me tighter, telling me to hush, telling me that the only thing that mattered was that I was safe and that we were finally together again. An hour later, we were driving back toward Savannah. Jasmine was behind the wheel of her sleek black sedan, navigating the busy Atlanta highways heading south toward the coast. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the city skyline fade away in the rearview mirror. The heavy, crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest for months was completely gone. The lingering stiffness in my left leg felt like a minor inconvenience rather than a death sentence. The miraculous clarity in my mind was sharp and vibrant. The drive took several hours, but the time passed in a comfortable, beautiful silence. We did not need to fill the space with words. We just listened to the soft hum of the tires on the asphalt and the low, soothing sound of old soul music playing on the radio. As we approached the coastal region, I rolled down my window. The air shifted, becoming thick, humid, and rich with the familiar salty scent of the Atlantic Ocean and the sweet fragrance of Georgia pine. It was the smell of home. Jasmine turned onto my familiar suburban street. The massive oak trees draped in silver Spanish moss cast long, gentle shadows across the manicured lawns. She pulled the car into my wide gravel driveway and shifted the engine into park. I opened the passenger door and stepped out. I did not take the wooden cane. I left it resting on the floorboard of the car. I planted my dress shoes firmly on the gravel, standing tall and looking up at the house. It was a beautiful, sprawling, two-story brick home with a wide wraparound porch and tall plantation shutters. I had purchased this land 30 years ago. I had spent countless weekends painting the trim, fixing the roof, and planting the garden. Every single brick, every single beam was paid for by the sweat of my brow and the agonizing pain in my joints. But as I stood there, breathing in the fresh coastal air, a profound realization washed over me. I looked at the solid brick walls and the pristine front yard. I had fought so incredibly hard to save this piece of real estate. I had risked everything to stop Valerie from selling it out from under me. I had treated this house as the ultimate symbol of my life's work. I turned my head and looked at Jasmine. She was standing next to the car, bathed in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun, smiling at me with pure, unconditional love. I realized in that exact moment that the house did not actually matter. The bricks, the mortar, the polished hardwood floors, and the expensive furniture were just meaningless objects. They could be bought, sold, burned down, or rebuilt. The true wealth, the actual treasure of my existence was not the real estate portfolio. It was the absolute freedom to stand under the open sky without fear of betrayal. It was the quiet dignity of a man who had reclaimed his own sovereignty. And above all else, it was the beautiful, loyal daughter standing right beside me. I walked over to Jasmine and wrapped my arm securely around her shoulder, pulling her close. We stood together in the driveway, looking at the house in silence. The dark, terrible storm that had threatened to completely consume my life had finally passed. The toxic weeds had been completely uprooted and thrown into the fire. The path forward was clear and incredibly bright. I was 64 years old, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like my life was just beginning. Sometimes we spend decades building a fortress thinking it will protect us from the dangers of the outside world. But the most dangerous predators do not break through the front door. They walk right in with a sweet smile, they share your dinner table, and they slowly dismantle your life from the inside out. I learned the hard way that blind trust is a dangerous luxury. I learned that true family is not defined by who sleeps under your roof, but by who shows up to fight for you when you are standing at the absolute edge of the abyss. If my story resonates with you, if you have ever felt isolated, manipulated, or betrayed by someone you trusted with your entire heart, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this old dock worker's soul. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next life stories I share. And please tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It brings me genuine joy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to my voice and what time of day you are keeping me company. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and always protect your peace. The morning mist rolls gently across the surface of the tranquil water, just outside my bedroom window. I sit in a sturdy wooden rocking chair on my back deck, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, letting the warm Georgia sun wash over my face. I am 64 years old, and for the first time in over a decade, I am breathing the absolute freest air of my entire life. I look down at my hands. The heavy calluses from 30 years of grueling labor on the Savannah shipping docks are still there. The deep lines etched into my palms tell the story of a man who worked through freezing coastal rain and blistering summer heat to provide for his family. But my hands are no longer trembling. The physical weakness, the slurred speech, the agonizing, burning pain in my left hip, they have all completely vanished. My doctors called it a miraculous physical recovery, but I know the absolute truth. I was not dying from a medical condition. I was dying from the toxic, suffocating poison of living with a woman who was actively draining my life force. 6 months have passed since that explosive morning inside the real estate boardroom. 6 months since I stood up from my chair, abandoned my wooden cane, and shattered the flawless illusion my wife had spent years meticulously building. When I think back to that day, I do not feel a single ounce of regret or sorrow. I feel the profound, righteous peace of a man who reclaimed his sovereignty right at the absolute edge of the abyss. After the federal authorities marched Valerie and DeAndre out of that luxury brokerage in handcuffs, I made a massive, life-altering decision. I successfully reversed the fraudulent sale of my estate, ensuring that the massive brick house I had paid for with my own blood and sweat remained securely in my name. But when I finally walked back through those heavy front doors the following week, the house felt completely different. The sprawling wraparound porch and the tall plantation shutters no longer felt like a well-earned sanctuary. The walls echoed with the ghosts of Valerie's fake sweet voice and DeAndre's arrogant laughter. The entire property felt like a museum dedicated to my own foolish, blind trust. So I did what any smart man does when he finds a rotting foundation. I tore it down and started completely over. I officially listed the Savannah estate on the open market and sold it legally and transparently for its full premium value. I took that massive sum of cash and I moved away from the coastal city. I bought this beautiful, quiet lakeside property hidden away in the serene Georgia countryside. It is a stunning piece of land surrounded by tall, ancient pine trees and weeping willows. The house is a beautiful single-story cabin with wide open windows and a massive wooden deck that extends right over the gentle water. But the most important feature of this new property is not the scenic view or the fresh country air. The most important feature is that it is located just 20 minutes away from my beautiful daughter Jasmine and my 2 energetic grandchildren. The justice system moved with an incredible, ruthless efficiency. Jackson Cole, the federal prosecutor, Jasmine brought into my life, completely dismantled Valerie and DeAndre in the court of law. I attended their sentencing hearing just a few weeks ago. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom, wearing my sharp charcoal gray Sunday suit, resting my hands on my lap. I watched the bailiff lead DeAndre into the courtroom. The flashy designer jackets and the diamond-encrusted watches were completely gone. He was wearing a standard-issue dull orange federal jumpsuit. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed low, and his eyes were completely hollow. The judge showed him absolutely no mercy. DeAndre had knowingly participated in a complex scheme of international wire fraud and severe elder financial abuse. The judge sentenced him to 8 hard years in a federal penitentiary. As the sentence was read, DeAndre began to weep openly in the courtroom, crying like a terrified little boy. He looked back at me from across the room, mouthing the word "sorry," with tears streaming down his face. I did not blink. I did not nod. I simply stared at him with cold, unyielding iron in my eyes. I knew the absolute truth about his tears. He was not crying because he regretted betraying the man who had fed and clothed him for over a decade. He was crying because he knew the federal prison system was actually the safest place for him. Without the stolen money from my estate, his violent underground bookies had put a massive target on his back. Prison was his only remaining sanctuary, and it was going to be a long, miserable, terrifying 8 years. Then it was Valerie's turn to face the absolute full weight of her crimes. She was escorted into the courtroom, and the sight of her almost took my breath away. The sophisticated, wealthy matriarch, the woman who wore elegant white designer dresses and expensive Parisian perfume, had completely evaporated. She looked exhausted, pale, and stripped of all her arrogant power. The judge looked down at her from the high bench and delivered a scathing reprimand. He told the entire courtroom that her actions represented the absolute lowest form of human greed. He detailed how she had ruthlessly preyed upon a vulnerable, disabled husband, how she had drained his retirement accounts to fund a secret romantic life in Jamaica, and how she had forged federal documents to steal his generational wealth. Valerie tried to deploy her sweet, innocent victim routine one final time. She fell to her knees, right there in the middle of the federal courtroom, screaming and sobbing hysterically. She cried out that she was a devoted wife, that she deserved half of the estate assets because she had dedicated the best years of her life to my household. She demanded leniency, claiming that state marital laws entitled her to a portion of the funds. Her own defense attorney had to forcefully pull her back up to her feet. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down violently, silencing her chaotic outburst. He stated with absolute cold authority that under state and federal law, her deliberate engagement in felony fraud entirely voided any marital claim she might have possessed. By attempting to steal the entire pie, she had legally forfeited her right to even a single crumb. The judge sentenced Valerie to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I watched as the police officers gripped her arms and led her out of the courtroom. She fought against them, screaming my name, her perfectly curated life of luxury shattering into a million unrecoverable pieces. She had gambled my entire existence for a beachfront villa in Montego Bay, and she had lost absolutely everything. She will spend the next decade of her life sleeping on a thin cot, surrounded by concrete walls, eating bland institutional food. The poetic justice of her fate is something I think about often as I sit on my deck and watch the sun set over the lake. Now my days are filled with genuine peace and actual unconditional love. Every single weekend, Jasmine drives out to the lake house, bringing my 2 young grandsons with her. The silence of the countryside is broken by the beautiful, joyful sound of children laughing and running across the wooden deck. I sit in my rocking chair, and I watch them cast their little fishing lines into the water. I teach them how to bait a hook, how to be patient, and how to respect the natural world around them. Jasmine sits beside me sipping sweet tea, and we talk for hours about life, about the future, and about all the years we lost when Valerie intentionally drove a wedge between us. Jasmine is a fierce, brilliant woman. She protected me when I was at my absolute weakest, and she proved that true blood loyalty cannot be severed by a manipulative outsider. When I look at her, I see the absolute best parts of myself. The house, the money, the real estate portfolio, none of those things represent my true wealth. My true wealth is the freedom to sit on this porch without fear of betrayal, and the profound blessing of having a daughter who loves me for the man I am not, the bank accounts I hold. I want to take a moment to step back and speak directly to you. I want to speak directly to the hardworking men listening to my voice right now. To the fathers, the uncles, the grandfathers, the brothers who wake up before the sun rises. To the men who break their backs on the shipping docks, the construction sites, the assembly lines, and the factory floors. We are a generation of men taught that our absolute primary value is our ability to provide. We are taught to endure grueling physical pain, to swallow our complaints, and to quietly carry the heavy financial burdens of our households. We believe that if we just work hard enough and provide enough material comfort, we will automatically earn the respect and the peaceful retirement we so desperately crave. But I am here to tell you a hard, painful truth. Love your family fiercely, but never under any circumstances hand over the keys to your own survival. Do not let your desire for a quiet, peaceful house blind you to the reality of human greed. Keep your eyes wide open. You must be an active participant in your own life. Verify your bank accounts, check your financial statements, and know exactly where your hard-earned money is going. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust is a devastating vulnerability. Do not ever let anyone convince you that you are a burden in the very house you built with your own sweat and blood. If you get sick, if your body breaks down after decades of heavy labor, you deserve absolute respect and dignified care. Do not let a spouse or an ungrateful child treat you like a piece of broken furniture, ready to be discarded into a miserable facility just so they can claim your assets. You earned your rest. You earned your peace. Trust is a privilege that must be continuously earned every single day through actions not blindly given just because someone wears a wedding ring or calls you their family. I survived the darkest, most terrifying storm of my life because I finally decided to wake up. I decided to fight back using patient strategy and cold, hard evidence. I reclaimed my dignity and I secured my legacy for the people who actually deserve it. I am living proof that you can rebuild your life and find true, profound happiness even after suffering the ultimate betrayal. If this story brought a little warmth to your heart or gave you the wake-up call you desperately needed, please hit that like button for this old man. It shows me that I am not standing alone and that my words mean something to you. Subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss the next life story I am going to share. We have to look out for one another and share these hard truths. And please do me a favor, drop down into the comments and tell me what city or state are you watching this video from and what time is it there right now. It brings genuine joy to this father's heart to see how far my voice can travel and to know what time of day you are keeping me company. Stay strong, protect your peace, keep your eyes open, and I will see you in the next story. With love and respect.